The custom-sewn straps of Staff Sergeant Alina Vance's trauma ruck felt like teeth biting into her collarbones as she stood in the pre-dawn rain of Joint Base Lewis McChord, watching First Sergeant Miller eye the bulging, non-standard pouches with the kind of suspicion most men reserved for a ticking bomb. It was 04:15, and the air smelled of wet cedar, diesel exhaust, and the stale, metallic tang of 1,000 damp uniforms waiting to move. Miller was a man built out of gristle and bad intentions, a 20-year infantry veteran from a hard-scrabble town in North Texas who believed that if a piece of equipment wasn't issued by the United States Army, it was a liability. He stopped in front of Alina, his boots splashing mud onto her shins, and pointed a blunt, calloused finger at the unauthorized roll of surgical-grade steel instruments she had tucked into a side pocket of her kit. He didn't say anything at first, letting the silence of the assembly area amplify the sound of the rain hitting the nylon of her pack. He looked at the kit, then up at her face, searching for a flicker of hesitation in her eyes that she had spent 12 years learning how to bury. The weight of the ruck was 42 pounds, not including her rifle or her body armor, and Alina held it with a stillness that was unnatural. She was from the Missouri Ozarks, a place where people learned to fix what was broken because there wasn't any money to buy it new, and she carried the quiet, heavy-lidded gaze of someone who had seen exactly what happens when a body is pushed past its breaking point. Her father had been the only man for 50 miles who could fix a grandfather clock or a shattered horse's leg, and he had passed that steady, terrifyingly precise dexterity down to her. She didn't need his validation, and she certainly didn't need Miller's, but she knew the rules of the hierarchy. She knew that in this unit, the 2nd Battalion, 1st Infantry Regiment, she was an outsider, a medic attached to a line company that viewed her gender as a variable and her specialized equipment as a vanity. Miller finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the idling of the nearby Stryker vehicles. He asked her if she was planning on opening a jewelry store or if she just liked carrying extra weight to make the rest of the platoon feel bad. He reached out and flicked the edge of a custom-ground hemostat she had modified herself, the metal ringing with a high, clear note that felt far too delicate for the mud and the dark. He told her that a real medic only needed gauze, a tourniquet, and the sense to keep their head down, and then he laughed, a short, dry sound that didn't reach his eyes. He called her the surgeon, a nickname that had started as a joke in the barracks and had curdled into a way to dismiss her every time she suggested a more advanced medical protocol during their pre-deployment workups. Alina didn't blink. She didn't defend the kit. She simply told him that the weight was hers to carry, and that as long as she kept pace on the ruck marches, what she carried in her bags was a matter of clinical discretion. Miller grunted, kicked a clump of mud toward her boots, and moved on to the next soldier, leaving her standing in the rain with the knowledge that she was one mistake away from having her life's work confiscated and replaced with standard issue mediocrity. PFC Silas, a 19-year-old from a corn-fed suburb of Columbus, Ohio, was standing 2 feet to her left, his knuckles white as he gripped his M4. He was the only one who had seen her in the quiet hours of the night, sitting in the corner of the company day room with a headlamp on, practicing microsutures on the skin of a grape until she could close a tear without bruising the fruit. He had watched her once, 3 weeks ago, when a stray dog had been hit by a supply truck near the motor pool, while the other soldiers had looked away or reached for their sidearms to put the animal out of its misery. Alina had knelt in the grease and the gravel. She hadn't said a word. She had simply opened that mocked medical kit, and with movements so fast and fluid they looked like a dance, she had clamped an artery and stabilized a shattered hip using nothing but the tools Miller hated and the steady heat of her own focus. Silas hadn't told anyone what he saw, mostly because he didn't have the words for it, but he watched her now with a look of quiet, terrified reverence. He knew what the others didn't, that Alina Vance wasn't just a medic. She was something much more dangerous and much more necessary. The orders for the training exercise were supposed to be routine. A 3-day navigation and live-fire maneuver in the dense, mountainous terrain of the Yakima Firing Center, a place where the wind howled through the basalt canyons and the temperature could drop 40 degrees the moment the sun touched the horizon. But as the convoy of strikers began to roll out, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just a training cycle. There were whispers coming over the high-side comms about a domestic threat, a coordinated sabotage of the regional power grid, and an unidentified group of extremists moving through the very wilderness where the 2nd Battalion was headed. The Opfer, the opposing force they usually fought in drills, was being augmented by real-world intelligence. The line between a rehearsal and a mission was blurring in real time, and Alina could feel it in the way the air pressure seemed to drop inside the cramped, metallic belly of the troop carrier. The interior of the striker was a cathedral of olive drab and hydraulic fluid. Alina sat opposite Miller, their knees nearly touching in the narrow aisle. The first sergeant was checking his GPS, his face illuminated by the pale blue light of the screen, his jaw set in a permanent line of aggression. He looked at her again, his eyes lingering on the ruck she held between her boots. He told her to make sure she didn't trip over her own gear when they hit the drop zone, his tone mocking but his eyes darting to the radio headset every few seconds. He was a man who understood violence, but he didn't understand the kind of chaos that didn't have a front line. He didn't understand that the world was changing around them, and that the dark trench they were headed toward wasn't just a metaphorical place of hardship, but a literal reality that was waiting for them in the shadows of the Cascades. The smell of the striker was a mixture of sweat and CLP, the lubricant used for the rifles. Alina closed her eyes and let her mind retreat to the Missouri woods, to the sound of her father's workshop. She remembered the way he would hold a tiny, microscopic gear with a pair of tweezers, his breathing so shallow it was non-existent. "The trick isn't the tool, Elle," he had told her when she was 7, after she had accidentally snapped a hairspring on an old pocket watch. "The trick is knowing that the metal is just an extension of your own blood. If you're nervous, the metal knows. If you're afraid, the metal fails." She had carried that lesson into her clinical rotations at Fort Sam Houston, and then into the ERs of trauma centers, where she had spent her leave time volunteering just to see more blood, more bone, more of the puzzle that was the human body. She had learned to see the anatomy of a person not as a collection of organs, but as a map of potential failures and repairs. She could look at Miller and see the slight tremor in his left hand that suggested a cervical nerve impingement, or the way Sila's favored his right ankle, indicating a grade 1 sprain he was too scared to report. She saw everything, and she said nothing. The transition from the base to the training area was a blur of highway lights and rising elevation. By the time the ramp dropped, they were deep in the high desert scrub and old-growth timber. The rain had turned to a biting, horizontal sleet that stung the skin like needles. They were supposed to be establishing a defensive perimeter on Ridge 404, a jagged spine of rock that overlooked a strategic valley. The plan was simple: dig in, wait for the enemy to probe the line, and then execute a counter-assault. But as Alina stepped out into the mud, her boots sinking 6 inches into the muck, she felt a vibration in the ground that didn't come from a striker engine. It was a low-frequency thud, followed by a flash of light on the northern horizon that was too bright for a flare and too sustained for lightning. Miller saw it too. He went from mocking to lethal in the span of a heartbeat. He started barking orders, his voice cutting through the wind, telling the men to get their entrenching tools out and start digging. "This isn't a drill anymore, boys," he yelled, though the official word hadn't come down yet. "I want a trench line 6 feet deep, and I want it 10 minutes ago. Vance, get your fancy ass in the hole and try not to get blood on your manicure." He thought he was being funny, a way to keep the men's nerves from fraying as the distant sounds of actual combat, real, rhythmic small arms fire, began to drift toward them on the wind. But Alina wasn't listening to his jokes. She was looking at the way the light was reflecting off the trees. She noticed the lack of bird noise. She noticed the way the wind had suddenly died, leaving a vacuum of silence that felt like a predator holding its breath. The digging was brutal. The soil was a layer of frozen mud, over a bed of volcanic basalt. The soldiers of the 2nd Battalion were young, strong, and terrified. They swung their shovels with a desperate energy, the sound of metal striking stone echoing through the woods. Elena dug her own section of the trench, her movements efficient and rhythmic. She didn't waste energy on grunting or complaining. She saved her strength for the precision she knew she would need later. Beside her, Silas was struggling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached over, adjusted the angle of his shovel with a single, firm hand and whispered, "Breathe from your stomach, Silas. Don't fight the rock. Find the seams." He looked at her, his eyes wide under his helmet, and nodded. For a moment, there was a connection between them, a recognition that while Miller was the commander of their bodies, Elena was the guardian of their survival. The dark trench began to take shape, a jagged scar in the earth, barely wide enough for a man to lie in, reinforced with sandbags and the sheer will of the infantry. It was cold, the kind of cold that reached into the marrow of your bones and stayed there. As the sun disappeared completely, replaced by a thick, oppressive canopy of clouds, the first of the real casualties began to arrive. It wasn't an enemy force in uniforms. It was a chaotic, disorganized attack by a group that used IEDs and high-caliber hunting rifles, a domestic insurgency that had turned the training exercise into a slaughterhouse. The first explosion happened 300 yards to their flank. It wasn't the loud, theatrical boom of a movie. It was a dull, earth-shaking thump that threw a shower of dirt and pine needles over the trench. Then came the screams. They were high-pitched and raw, the sound of men who hadn't yet processed that they were no longer whole. Miller stood up, peering over the lip of the trench, his rifle raised. "Hold the line," he roared. "Nobody moves until I say. Vance, stay in the hole." Elena ignored him. She was already opening the buckles on her ruck. She didn't do it with a flourish. She did it with the same quiet focus she used to fix a clock. She pulled out a pair of trauma shears and a vacuum-sealed pack of hemostatic gauze. She could hear the distinct sound of a sucking chest wound coming from the darkness to their left, a rhythmic, wet whistling that most people wouldn't even notice over the sound of the wind. She knew that sound. It was Private Henderson, a kid from Seattle who had talked about his girlfriend all the way up the mountain. "I'm going out," Elena said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. Miller turned, his face contorted in a snarl. "You stay put, Sergeant. That's an order. We don't have eyes on the shooters yet." "Henderson is dying," she replied. She didn't look at Miller. She looked at the darkness where the whistling was getting weaker. "If I don't go now, he's gone in 3 minutes. You can court-martial me when we get back to Lewis." She didn't wait for his response. She rolled over the edge of the trench and disappeared into the mud. The world outside the hole was a nightmare of shadows and muzzle flashes. She crawled on her stomach, the weight of her medical kit dragging behind her like a tether. She found Henderson slumped against a shattered cedar tree, his chest heaving. The copper smell of fresh blood was overwhelming, mixing with the scent of burnt gunpowder. She didn't ask him where it hurt, she already knew. She felt for the entry wound, her fingers moving like a blind person reading Braille. She found the hole, small, jagged, right between the 3rd and 4th ribs. She reached into her vanity kit and pulled out a specialized occlusive dressing, not the standard plastic square, but a vented, hydrogel seal she had sourced from a tactical medical supplier in North Carolina. She applied it with a firm, steady pressure, watching as the whistling stopped and Henderson's breathing stabilized. But as she was reaching for her bag to get a line of fluids into him, the earth erupted again. This time, the explosion was closer. It was a mortar round, or something like it, hitting the edge of the trench line where Miller was standing. Elena was thrown backward, the air punched out of her lungs. She tasted dirt and salt. When her vision cleared, the world was ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the wind. She scrambled back toward the trench, her hands shaking for the first time in her life. She found the hole, but it was no longer a defensive position. It was a ruin of collapsed dirt and broken timber. And there, in the center of the carnage, was First Sergeant Miller. He was pinned under a heavy section of the trench wall that had been reinforced with a fallen log. His face was a mask of gray, His eyes rolled back in his head. But it was his leg that stopped Alina's heart. The log had crushed his femoral artery against a sharp shelf of basalt. Blood wasn't just leaking out, it was geysering, a bright arterial spray that was painting the mud a horrific shade of crimson. In the dim light of a burning striker in the distance, Alina could see the bone, white and jagged, protruding through the fabric of his trousers. The men around him, Silas, Henderson, who had crawled back, and a few others, were frozen. They were looking at the man who had been their anchor, and they were seeing a corpse in waiting. Silas was trembling so hard his helmet was rattling against his skull. He looked at Alina, his eyes begging her to do something, to be the person he had seen fixing the dog in the motor pool. Alina dropped to her knees beside Miller. The cold rain was still falling, mixing with the blood. She reached into her bag, her fingers finding the specialized kit Miller had mocked only hours before. She didn't look at the men, she didn't look at the fire, she looked at the wound. "Silas," she said, and her voice was a cold, sharp blade that cut through the boy's panic. "Get over here, hold this light. If you move it even an inch, the first sergeant dies. Do you understand me?" Silas scrambled over, gripping a tactical flashlight with both hands. The beam was shaky, but it illuminated the nightmare of Miller's leg. The blood was everywhere. It was in Alina's hair, under her fingernails, soaking into her sleeves. She didn't hesitate. She didn't use a standard tourniquet. The bone was too shattered, the tissue too mangled for a simple pressure strap to work. She needed to go inside. She pulled out a small, sterile roll of tools. She selected a pair of long-reach arterial clamps, the ones Miller had called jewelry tools. She looked at the man who had dismissed her, who had laughed at her expertise, and she felt nothing but a cold, hard competence. She wasn't doing this for his thanks. She was doing it because the mission was survival, and she was the only one who knew the way. "I need a clean field," she muttered to herself, her hands moving with a speed that was impossible to follow. She used a bottle of sterile saline to wash away the worst of the mud. She could see the artery now. It had retracted into the muscle, a pulsing, broken tube that was emptying Miller's life into the dirt. She reached into the wound. The sound of her gloved hands moving through the wet tissue was sickening, a soft, squelching noise that made Silas gag. But Alina didn't flinch. She felt for the heat of the pulse. She found the end of the vessel, the metal of her clamp sliding into the dark, gore-slicked opening of the leg. She clicked the clamp shut. The spray stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the explosion. The men in the trench held their breath, watching as Alina Vance, the surgeon, the woman they had overlooked, worked in the mud and the dark with the precision of a master watchmaker. She wasn't just stopping the bleeding, she was reconstructing a human being. But as she reached for the micro-suture kit to begin the temporary bypass that would save the leg from amputation, a new sound emerged from the woods. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of heavy boots on the basalt and the distinctive click of a safety being flicked to semi-auto. The threat wasn't over. They were pinned in a dark trench with a dying leader, and the people who had done this were coming to finish the job. Alina looked up, her face covered in Miller's blood, and met Silas's eyes. "Hand me the scalpel," she said, her voice a whisper that sounded like a vow. "And then get your rifle. We're not done yet." The rain turned to ice as it hit the ground, a freezing glaze that made every movement a gamble. Alina's hands were the only thing in the world that felt warm, heated by the frantic, failing life of the man who had spent the last 6 months trying to break her spirit. She could feel Miller's heart rate through the clamp, thready, irregular, the rhythm of a machine running out of fuel. Around them, the trench had become a tomb of freezing mud. The smell of the cedar trees was now entirely replaced by the metallic, heavy scent of a slaughterhouse. Silas handed her the scalpel, his hand still shaking, but he didn't look away. The flashlight beam flickered as a nearby explosion sent a shockwave through the earth, showering them with grit. Alina didn't even flinch. She had the scalpel in her right hand and the long-reach forceps in her left. She was performing a field-expedient vascular shunt, a procedure that wasn't in any army manual, something that shouldn't have been possible in a hole in the ground in the middle of a Pacific Northwest winter. "Keep the light steady." "Silas," she said. Her voice was a low, melodic contrast to the chaos. "Talk to me. Tell me what you see in the tree line." I see shadows, Sergeant," Silas stammered, his eyes darting between the surgical site and the lip of the trench. Moving toward the striker. 3, maybe 4 of them. They've got nods on, night vision. Elena didn't look up. She made a precise incision through the fascia of Miller's thigh, clearing the path for the shunt. How far? 50 yards. Maybe less. "Check your sectors," she commanded. "Henderson, get on the SAW. Do not fire until they reach the charred cedar. We need to conserve ammo." She heard the heavy clatter of the squad automatic weapon being braced against a sandbag. Henderson, still clutching the chest seal she had applied to him, moved with the stiff, robotic grace of the wounded. The hierarchy of the unit had dissolved. Miller was a lump of meat and fading consciousness on the floor of the trench. The officers were somewhere else, caught in the initial blast or cut off by the sabotage. There was only the medic and the boys she was refusing to let die. Elena slid the plastic tubing, the shunt, into the artery. It was a delicate maneuver. If she pushed too hard, she would tear the vessel wall. If she didn't seat it properly, the pressure would blow the seal the moment she released the clamp. She felt the resistance of the muscle, the slickness of the blood. She thought of her father's hands, the way he could feel the tension in a spring without looking at it. She closed her eyes for a split second, visualizing the anatomy, the red-blue-white map of the human leg. She pushed the shunt home. "Clamp off," she whispered. She released the metal grip. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the plastic tube filled with a dark, rich red. The blood was flowing again, bypassing the shattered section of the artery. Miller's chest gave a sudden, violent heave, a gasp of air that sounded like a drowning man reaching the surface. His eyes flickered open, landing on Elena's face. He couldn't speak, his jaw was locked in a shock-induced spasm, but the recognition was there. He saw the tools, he saw the blood, he saw the woman he had mocked holding his life in her hands. "Stay with me, First Sergeant," Elena said, her eyes locked on his. "Don't you dare close your eyes. You still owe me for that ruck you kicked." A burst of gunfire erupted from the tree line. The rounds hissed overhead, snapping through the air with the sound of tearing silk. Henderson returned fire, the SAW thudding in short, disciplined bursts that lit up the trench in rhythmic flashes of orange. The smell of ozone and burnt powder filled the hole, stinging Elena's eyes, but she didn't stop. She was already reaching for the K-wires, the thin, stainless steel rods she had tucked into her kit. Miller's femur was shattered, the bone fragments acting like shrapnel inside his own leg. If she didn't stabilize it, the jagged edges would sever the shunt the moment they tried to move him. "Sila's rifle," she said. The boy dropped the light, and for a terrifying second they were plunged into a flickering, red-tinged darkness. Silas grabbed his M4 and leveled it over the sandbags, adding his fire to Henderson's. Elena didn't need the light anymore. She had the map in her mind. She felt for the fracture, her fingers navigating the wreckage of the bone. She took the first K-wire and, using the pressure of her own body weight, began to guide it through the soft tissue to bridge the break. The pain must have been unimaginable. Miller's hand flew up, grabbing Elena's forearm with a crushing strength. He let out a sound, not a scream, but a low, guttural animal moan. Elena didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her face inches from his, her eyes hard and unyielding. "Hold on to me," she said. "Use the pain, don't let go." She pushed the wire through. The bone grated, a sound that made Silas's stomach turn, but the fracture held. She repeated the process with the second wire, creating a temporary external fixator with the tools she had modified in her Missouri kitchen. She was sweating now, despite the freezing rain, the salt stinging the cuts on her own face. The gunfire from the tree line intensified. A grenade landed 20 meters away, the explosion sending a wall of mud and rock over the trench. The striker in the distance was a roaring inferno now, the light from the fire casting long, dancing shadows across the woods. The Opfer was no longer probing, they were closing in for the kill. "They're coming over the top," Henderson screamed, his voice breaking. Elena finished the last suture on Miller's leg, her movements a blur of impossible speed. She didn't have time to pack the bag. She grabbed her rifle, a standard M4 she hadn't fired since the range at Fort Riley, and stood up in the mud beside Silas and Henderson. "First Sergeant is stabilized," she said, her voice rising above the din of the combat. "But we're not leaving him. We're not leaving anyone. Silas, get on his left. Henderson on his right. When I say move, we're heading for the drainage culvert behind us. It leads to the low ground." "We can't carry him," Silas cried, his eyes wide with terror. "We'll never make it." Elena looked at him, and for the first time, she let the controls slip just enough for him to see the fire underneath the ice. "We are the 2nd Battalion," she said. "We don't leave our own. Now grab the damn stretcher." She didn't wait for them to agree. She grabbed the front of the litter, her fingers locking onto the handles. She looked down at Miller. He was conscious now, his face pale as a ghost, but his hand moved, a small, trembling gesture toward his own sidearm. He couldn't walk, but he could still fight. He looked at Elena, and for a brief, flickering second, the 1st Sergeant of the 1st Infantry Regiment nodded. It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement. "Go," Miller rasped, the word a puff of red mist in the cold air. They moved. It was a slow, agonizing crawl out of the dark trench. Elena led them, her rifle slung across her chest, her hands raw and bleeding as she dragged the weight of the man who had dismissed her through the freezing muck. The enemy fire followed them, chewing up the ground at their heels. The world was a chaotic nightmare of sound and light, of pain and freezing rain. As they reached the edge of the drainage culvert, a concrete tunnel that offered the only hope of cover, a figure emerged from the shadows of the trees. It was a man in dark, non-military tactical gear, his rifle raised, his face hidden by a mask. He was less than 10 feet away. Elena didn't think. She didn't have time to be a medic. The transition was instantaneous, from the woman who could heal a vessel to the woman who could end a threat. She dropped the handle of the stretcher, her rifle coming up in a single, fluid motion. She fired 3 rounds, the muzzle flashes illuminating the blood on her face. The man fell backward into the brush, his rifle clattering against the stones. She didn't check the body. She didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. She simply picked up the handle of the stretcher and kept moving. They slid into the culvert, the cold water rising to their waists. It was a dark, echoing tunnel that smelled of wet concrete and old earth. They moved in silence, the only sound the splashing of their boots and the ragged breathing of the wounded. They walked for what felt like miles, deep into the heart of the mountain, away from the fires and the screams. When they finally emerged on the other side, in a secluded ravine hidden by a thicket of hemlocks, the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon. The sky was a bruised purple, the rain finally tapering off into a fine, ghostly mist. They laid Miller down on a dry patch of pine needles. Elena immediately knelt beside him, her hands going to the shunt in his leg. It was still holding. The pulse was stronger now, a steady, rhythmic throb against her fingertips. She looked at his face. He was watching her, his breathing shallow but regular. Silas and Henderson collapsed against the trunk of a tree, their rifles across their laps. They were alive, they were all alive. Silas looked at Elena, then at the medical kit that was now caked in mud and blood. "They're going to want to know how you did it," he whispered, his voice thick with exhaustion. "The doctors, the colonel, they're going to ask how a medic in a trench saved a leg that was gone." Elena didn't look up. She was wiping the blood from her scalpels, her movements careful, almost reverent. She thought of her father's workshop. She thought of the grandfather clock that had ticked for 100 years, because someone had known how to fix the heart of it. "The report will say we followed standard protocol," Elena said, her voice flat and steady. "The report will say we survived because of the training. The report will be wrong." She looked at Miller. The 1st Sergeant reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the surgical kit he had mocked in the rain at Lewis McCord. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence between them was the sound of a debt that could never be repaid, a recognition that the woman he had tried to sideline was the only reason he was still breathing the morning air. Elena Vance closed the bag. She felt the weight of it, the 42 pounds of steel and gauze and specialized tools that had cost her so much and had saved everything. She looked toward the horizon, where the distant sound of helicopters, real American medevac birds, was finally beginning to grow. She knew what was coming: the questions, the investigations, the quiet institutional attempt to file her away into a folder. But as she stood up in the gray light of the Pacific Northwest morning, her back straight and her hands finally still, she didn't care. She had seen the truth in the dark of the trench. She knew what she was capable of, even if the world wasn't ready to see it yet. And as the first Black Hawk appeared over the ridge, its rotors beating a steady rhythm against the silence, Alina Vance took a breath of the cold, clean air and waited for the next mission. The silence in the ravine was broken only by the approaching thrum of the Black Hawk's rotors, a sound that usually signaled the end of a nightmare. But for Alina, as she watched the grass flatten under the downdraft, the noise felt like the beginning of a different kind of combat. She knew how the army worked. She knew that a staff sergeant performing an unauthorized vascular shunt on a first sergeant in a muddy hole was not going to be greeted with a parade. It was going to be greeted with a stack of paperwork and a battery of lawyers. Miller was being hoisted into the bird first. As the litter was secured, he grabbed the arm of the flight medic, a young, clean-shaven sergeant who looked like he'd never seen a day of real dirt in his life. Miller pulled the man down close to his face, his voice a rasping growl that managed to carry over the roar of the engines. "You look at that leg," Miller commanded, pointing a trembling finger at the makeshift fixator Alina had built. "You look at it, and you don't touch a damn thing until you get him to a real surgeon. And you tell them Vance did it." The flight medic looked at Alina, his eyes wide behind his goggles. He looked at the blood-soaked woman standing in the mud, holding a rifle like she'd been born with it, and he nodded slowly. Alina didn't follow them into the helicopter. There wasn't room, and her place was still with the remnants of her platoon. She stood on the edge of the clearing with Silas and Henderson, watching the bird lift off, its belly red from the reflection of the rising sun. The wind from the rotors whipped her hair across her face, stinging the cuts on her cheeks. "Sergeant?" Silas asked, his voice small against the receding roar. "Yeah, Silas. What happens now?" Alina looked at the empty sky, then down at her hands. They were stained deep with Miller's blood, the dark crimson etched into the lines of her palms like a map. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss, not for the man, but for the person she had been before the first explosion. She was different now. The surgeon wasn't a nickname anymore. It was a reality that lived in the marrow of her bones. "Now," Alina said, her voice regaining that terrifying, Missouri-bred stillness, "we go find the rest of our unit, and we find out who started this." She turned and began to walk back toward the smoking ruins of the training area, her boots heavy in the mud. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Behind her, the dark trench was already being reclaimed by the rain and the shadows, but the memory of what had happened there was etched into the earth. 2 days later, Alina sat in a sterile, windowless room at Madigan Army Medical Center. The air smelled of industrial bleach and floor wax. She had been questioned for 6 hours by a board of inquiry, 3 colonels and a JAG officer who seemed more interested in the cost of her unauthorized medical supplies than the fact that Miller was currently recovering in the ICU with both his life and his leg intact. They had called her reckless. They had called her unprofessional. They had used words like liability and breach of protocol. Alina had sat through all of it with her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of polite indifference. She didn't explain the anatomy of a femoral shunt. She didn't tell them about the sound of the K-wire clicking into place. She let them talk until their voices ran dry. Finally, the door opened, and a man in a rumpled suit, a civilian from the Department of Defense, walked in. He looked at the board, then at Alina. He held a single sheet of paper in his hand. "The first sergeant is awake," the man said. The room went silent. "He's given his statement," the man continued, his eyes locked on Alina. "He says that if it weren't for Staff Sergeant Vance, the 2nd Battalion would be burying 4 men this week." He also said that if any of you tries to file a disciplinary action against her, he'll spend his retirement making sure you never see a star. The colonels looked at each other, their faces tightening. The JAG officer cleared his throat and began to shuffle his papers. Elena stood up. She didn't wait for them to dismiss her. She walked out of the room, her boots clicking on the linoleum floor. She walked through the hospital corridors, past the grieving families and the wounded soldiers, until she reached the surgical recovery wing. She found Miller's room at the end of the hall. He was hooked up to a dozen monitors, his leg elevated and encased in a complex web of modern medical tech. He looked smaller in the hospital bed, stripped of his armor and his authority. He saw her through the glass and beckoned her in with a weak wave of his hand. Elena stepped inside. The silence was different here, not the silence of a predator, but the silence of a truce. "They're going to give you a medal, Vance," Miller said, his voice a ghost of its former rasp. "A silver star, probably, or they'll try to hush it up and give you a commendation with a V device." "I don't want a medal," Elena said. "I know you don't," Miller replied. He looked at his leg, then back at her. "You want to be the best medic in the army, and you are, but you're also a pain in my ass." A small, genuine smile touched Elena's lips, the first one in years. "The feeling is mutual, First Sergeant." "The kit," Miller said, his eyes turning serious. "The one I kicked, where is it?" "Evidence locker," she said. "They're evaluating it." Miller grunted. "Tell them to give it back, and tell them I want 3 more just like it for the rest of the medics in the company. If they give you any trouble, tell them to talk to me." Elena nodded. She turned to leave, but Miller's voice stopped her one last time. "Vance." "Yes, First Sergeant. You were right about the weight. It's only a liability if you don't know how to carry it." Elena stepped out into the hallway. The sun was streaming through the windows of the hospital, casting long, golden bars across the floor. She felt the weight of her own life, the cost of the things she knew and the things she had done. It was heavy, heavier than any ruck she had ever carried. But as she walked toward the exit, her head held high and her hands steady, she knew she could carry it. She walked out into the American morning, the sound of the world continuing around her, the traffic, the birds, the distant hum of the base. She was a woman who had been dismissed, mocked, and overlooked, but she was also the woman who had performed the impossible in a dark trench. And as she reached her car, she saw a small, wrapped package sitting on the driver's seat. She opened it. Inside was a new set of surgical-grade hemostats, the metal gleaming in the sun. There was no note, but she didn't need one. She knew the handwriting of the man who had left it. Elena Vance tucked the tool into her pocket, the cold metal a familiar weight against her thigh. She started the engine and drove toward the mountains, toward the place where the world was still broken, and where she would be waiting to fix it. The road out of the base wound through the towering Douglas firs, their branches heavy with the morning mist. Elena drove with the windows down, letting the cold air clear the smell of the hospital from her lungs. She thought about Silas and Henderson, who were already back in the barracks, probably telling exaggerated stories about the surgeon, and the night the mountain tried to swallow them whole. She thought about her father, sitting in his workshop in Missouri, unaware that his daughter had used his lessons to hold back the dark. She realized then that the extraordinary capability everyone talked about wasn't the steady hand or the medical knowledge. It was the ability to remain herself when everything else was stripped away. It was the loyalty to the person next to her, even when that person didn't deserve it. It was the knowledge that in a world of chaos, precision was the only thing that lasted. As she reached the crest of the hill overlooking the valley, she pulled over. The 2nd Battalion's training area was visible in the distance, a vast, rugged landscape that looked peaceful from this height, but Elena could still see the scars. She could see the places where the earth had been torn, and she knew that beneath the beauty of the forest, the dark trench was still there, a reminder of what it cost to be right in a world that punished it. She took the new hemostat out of her pocket and held it up to the light. It was perfect, balanced, strong. She felt a quiet sense of hope, not the loud, easy hope of a victory, but the small, persistent hope of someone who had survived the worst and was still standing. She was Elena Vance. She was a staff sergeant in the United States Army. She was a medic, and she was ready for whatever came next. She put the car in gear and drove down into the valley, the sun at her back and the road unfolding before her, one breath at a time. The asphalt of I-5 South was a slick, oil-stained ribbon of gray that hissed beneath Alina's tires, but the only sound she could actually hear was the phantom click of the hemostats she had left in the evidence locker at Madigan. The steering wheel of her 2014 Ford F-150 felt thin and fragile in her hands, a piece of consumer-grade plastic that lacked the honest, heavy weight of the tools she had used to stitch a man's life back together 48 hours ago. She was driving toward her small, rented house in Steilacoom, a place that always smelled of sea salt and damp cedar, but the internal compass she had relied on for 12 years was spinning wildly. The sun was a pale, watery disk behind the Washington clouds, offering light but no heat, and as she glanced in her rearview mirror, she saw the same dark blue Tahoe she had seen 3 exits back. It stayed exactly 4 car lengths behind her, maintaining a distance that was too consistent to be accidental. She didn't speed up. She didn't reach for the sidearm she kept in the center console. She simply watched the Tahoe, her breathing deep and rhythmic, the way her father had taught her to breathe when a storm was coming over the Missouri hills. The man in the Tahoe was a professional, likely CID or perhaps someone from the shadowy security detail that had arrived at the hospital shortly after Miller was stabilized. They weren't there to arrest her. Not yet. They were there to see who she talked to. They were there to see if the staff sergeant who had performed a miracle in a muddy trench was going to be a hero or a problem. In Alina's experience, the Army usually found it easier to deal with a problem than a hero who didn't fit the script. When she reached her driveway, she didn't go inside. She sat in the truck for a full minute, listening to the engine block ping as it cooled. The Tahoe pulled over 2 houses down, its engine idling, its windows tinted a deep, impenetrable black. Alina reached into her pocket and felt the new hemostat the first sergeant had somehow managed to get to her. It was a small comfort, a cold piece of steel that reminded her that reality wasn't what the colonel said it was in a sterile briefing room. Reality was what you could hold in your hands when the lights went out. She stepped out of the truck, the damp air hitting her face like a wet towel. Her body ached, a deep, marrow-deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. She had spent the last 2 days being dissected by men who had never seen a femoral artery spray, and the mental toll of maintaining her composure was beginning to outweigh the physical cost of the Yakima Mountains. She walked to her front door, the gravel crunching under her boots, and noticed a small, white smudge on the doorframe. It was a piece of chalk, a mark no bigger than a fingernail, placed at shoulder height. It was a signal she and Silas had agreed upon during their pre-deployment training, a what-if scenario they had joked about over bad coffee. If the mark was there, it meant the shadows weren't just in the woods, they were in the ranks. Alina entered her house, but she didn't turn on the lights. She moved through the living room with the practiced grace of a ghost, her eyes adjusting to the dim, gray light filtering through the blinds. She went straight to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and sat at the small wooden table her father had built for her when she first enlisted. She waited. 10 minutes passed. 20. The house was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, the same one she had fixed 3 times since she moved in. At the 30-minute mark, there was a soft, rhythmic scratching at the back door. It wasn't a knock, it was the sound of someone who didn't want to be heard. Alina stood up, her hand instinctively hovering near the kitchen knife block, but she didn't draw. She opened the door 6 inches. PFC Silas was standing on her porch, his OCPs rumpled and stained with grease, his face looking 10 years older than it had on the mountain. He wasn't wearing his cover, and his eyes were darting toward the street with a frantic, jittery energy that made Alina's chest tighten. He looked like a man who had seen the bottom of a grave and realized he was the one who had to dig it. "Sergeant," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I couldn't stay at the barracks. They're taking everything." The logs, the equipment lists, even the personal journals. They said it's a forensic audit for the after-action report, but they are only hitting the guys who were in the trench. Elena stepped back, gesturing for him to come inside. She closed the door and locked it, the heavy deadbolt clicking into place with a finality that felt like a bridge burning. She led him to the kitchen table and pushed the glass of water toward him. Silas drank it in 3 long, desperate gulps, his hands shaking so hard the glass rattled against his teeth. "Breathe, Silas," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor. "Tell me exactly what you saw." "It's not just the audit," Silas said, leaning in, the smell of gun oil and cold sweat clinging to him. "Henderson, they took him to a different floor at Madigan. They said his chest seal failed and he needed specialized observation. But I saw the charts, Sergeant. I slipped into the nurse's station when they were changing shifts." His chart wasn't marked as a combat injury. They listed it as a training accident, a mechanical malfunction during a live-fire drill. They're erasing what happened out there. They're making it like the insurgents weren't even real. Elena felt a cold, sharp blade of anger twist in her gut, but she didn't let it reach her face. She stayed controlled. She stayed the surgeon. "Why would they do that? We have the casualties. We have Miller's leg." "You can't explain away a vascular shunt with a training accident." "They're not trying to explain it away," Silas said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "They're trying to hide the lot numbers. I found a piece of the mortar casing, Sergeant, the one that hit the trench. I kept it in my pocket when we were moving Miller. I didn't tell anyone. I looked at the stamp this morning. It's U.S. issue. High explosive 60 mm. It didn't come from a domestic group. It came from our own supply depot at Fort Lewis. The people who attacked us, they were using our own gear, and someone in the command group knows it." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Elena looked at the young man across from her, a 19-year-old who just wanted to serve his country and go home to Ohio. He had seen the truth, and now he was a liability to an institution that valued its reputation more than its people. The gap between what they knew and what the Army was willing to acknowledge wasn't just a procedural error. It was a conspiracy that reached higher than a training exercise gone wrong. "Give me the casing," Elena said. Silas reached into his cargo pocket and pulled out a jagged, blackened shard of metal. It was heavy, the edges still sharp enough to draw blood. Elena took it, her fingers tracing the stamped numbers on the base. 12B 8843. She recognized the sequence. It wasn't just any lot number. It was a specific batch of munitions that had been flagged for disposal 6 months ago. She had seen the memo on the company bulletin board when she was doing her inventory. Those rounds shouldn't have been in a mortar tube. They should have been at a demolition range in Nevada. "You need to go back, Silas," Elena said, her mind already moving 3 steps ahead. "If you're AWOL, they'll use it to discredit everything you say. Go back to the barracks. Act like you're scared, act like you're confused. Don't mention the casing, don't mention me." "I can't go back there," Silas pleaded, his eyes wide. "They're watching me, Sergeant. Every time I turn a corner, there's an NCO I've never seen before, asking me questions about what I saw you do in the mud. They're trying to find a way to say you botched the surgery. They're trying to make it look like Miller survived asterisk despite asterisk you, not because of you." Elena stood up and walked to the window, peeling back a sliver of the blind. The dark blue Tahoe was still there, a silent predator under the street lamp. The institutional failure was unfolding in real time. It wasn't a speech or a dramatic confrontation. It was the quiet, systematic removal of evidence and the slow isolation of witnesses. It was a process designed to grind a person down until they doubted their own memories. But the one thing they didn't account for was the fact that Elena Vance didn't doubt herself. She didn't need their validation to know the color of arterial blood or the weight of a U.S.-issued mortar shell. "They won't break me, Silas," she said, her back to him. "And I won't let them break you. But we have to play their game until we can change the rules. You go back. You tell them you went for a walk to clear your head. If they ask about the casing, you tell them you lost it in the brush. Do you hear me?" Silas looked at her, and for a moment, the terror in his eyes was replaced by a flickering, desperate trust. He nodded once, a sharp, military movement. "Yes, Sergeant. And Sila's?" Elena turned to face him, her expression softening just enough for him to see the loyalty behind the ice. "I've got your back, always." After Sila's left through the back door, disappearing into the shadows of the tree line, Elena sat back down at the table. She held the mortar casing in her hand, the metal cold against her skin. She had a decision to make. She could take this to the IG, the Inspector General, and hope that the system still worked. She could try to find an officer she trusted, though after the Board of Inquiry, that list was dangerously short. Or she could do what her father would have done. She could fix it herself. She thought about the cost. If she went outside the chain of command, her career was over. The 12 years she had spent climbing the ranks, the medals she hadn't asked for, the respect she had earned in the motor pools and the trauma bays, it would all be gone. She would be a civilian with a dishonorable discharge and a memory of a war that officially didn't happen. But if she stayed silent, the people who had supplied those mortars would do it again. They would kill more boys like Henderson. They would leave more men like Miller broken in the mud. For Elena, it wasn't a choice. The mission was the survival of her soldiers, and that mission didn't end when the shooting stopped. The next morning, the system made its move. Elena arrived at the company headquarters at 0600, her uniform crisp, her boots shined to a mirror finish. She was met at the door by Captain Rhodes, the company commander, a man who had spent more time in a gym than in the field, his uniform always looking a size too small for his ego. He didn't look her in the eye. He looked at the clipboard in his hand, his jaw tight. "Sergeant Vance," Rhodes said, his voice devoid of its usual bluster. "By order of the battalion commander, you are being placed on administrative leave effective immediately. You are to surrender your ID card and your gear to the supply sergeant. You are restricted to your residence until further notice." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't ask why. She simply unclipped her ID from her belt and handed it to him. "On what grounds, Captain?" "Safety audit," Rhodes muttered, still looking at his clipboard. "There have been concerns raised about the non-standard equipment you were carrying in the field. We need to conduct a full review of your medical protocols. It's standard procedure for any incident involving a senior NCO casualty." "Standard procedure doesn't usually involve house arrest," Elena said, her voice flat and cold. Rhodes finally looked at her, and for a second she saw the shame in his eyes. He knew. He was a cog in the machine, and he was too afraid of losing his career to stop the gears from turning. "Just go home, Vance. Don't make this harder than it has to be." She walked to the supply room, where Sergeant Miller's replacement, a man named Gathers who looked like he'd been handpicked for his ability to follow orders without asking questions, was waiting. He held a large plastic bin. "Empty your ruck," Gathers said. Elena began to pull the items out. One by one, she laid them on the counter. The trauma shears, the vacuum-sealed gauze, the specialized chest seals. Each item felt like a piece of her own skin being peeled away. When she reached for the small, leather-wrapped roll of surgical instruments, Gathers stepped forward and grabbed her wrist. "That stays," he said. "The colonel specifically asked for the jewelry tools." Elena looked at his hand on her wrist, her eyes narrowing until Gathers felt the heat and pulled away. She didn't say a word. She placed the roll of instruments in the bin. She knew what they were doing. They weren't just taking her gear, they were taking her evidence. Those tools had Miller's blood on them, and more importantly, they had the microscopic traces of the basalt and the mud from the trench. If they could lose those tools, they could lose the proof of what she had done. She walked out of the building, the morning sun finally breaking through the clouds, but the world felt darker than it ever had in the trench. She drove back to Steilacoom, the Tahoe still following her, a constant shadow in her life. She was a soldier without a unit, a medic without a kit, a woman alone in a town that didn't know she existed. But she wasn't alone. 3 hours later, her burner phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the message was a single coordinate, a trailhead in the Nisqually Delta. 1400. She spent the morning preparing. She didn't have her ruck, but she had her father's old hunting pack. She didn't have her army-issued kit, but she had the backups she had hidden in the crawlspace of her house years ago, tools she had bought with her own money, modified in her own kitchen. She packed a small, sterile field kit, a handheld GPS, and a pair of high-powered binoculars. She felt a strange, dark sense of competence returning to her. The army could take her rank, they could take her ID, but they couldn't take the surgeon. She left the house through the basement window, a maneuver she had practiced a dozen times to avoid the Tahoe. She moved through the neighbor's yard, stayed in the shadows of the cedar trees, and reached her old mountain bike hidden under a tarp in the woods. She pedaled 5 miles to the trailhead, her lungs burning in the cold air, her mind focused on the coordinate. When she reached the delta, the tide was out, leaving a vast, shimmering expanse of mud and tall grass. The air smelled of salt and decay. Standing at the edge of the boardwalk was a figure she didn't expect to see, Sarah Miller, the first sergeant's wife. Sarah was a woman built of the same gristle as her husband, her face weathered by 20 years of military life, her eyes sharp and unblinking. She didn't say hello. She handed Alina a manila envelope. "He told me to give this to you," Sarah said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper that sounded like an echo of Miller's. "He said he couldn't trust the nurses, and he couldn't trust the command. He said you were the only one who wouldn't blink." Alina opened the envelope. Inside were copies of the supply manifests for the 2nd Battalion for the last 6 months. They were signed by a name she didn't recognize, a civilian contractor named Vanguard Solutions. But as she scanned the lists, she saw the lot numbers. 12B 8843. Thousands of rounds of disposed munitions that had been signed out to a training facility in the Cascades but had never arrived. "He's been tracking it for months," Sarah said. "He thought it was just a black market operation. NCOs selling gear on the side. But after the trench, he realized it's not just gear. They're using the training exercises to live test the equipment. They're using our own soldiers as the opfer. They're selling combat-proven results to the highest bidder." The scale of the betrayal was staggering. It wasn't just a cover-up, it was a business model. A private contractor was using the United States Army as a laboratory, and the command group was getting a kickback to look the other way. The insurgents in the woods hadn't been domestic extremists. They had been Vanguard employees, testing their munitions on the best soldiers in the world to see how they performed in a real-world scenario. "Why me?" Alina asked, looking at Sarah. "Why give this to me?" "Because," Sarah said, stepping closer, "my husband said you're the only person he's ever met who is more loyal to the truth than she is to the flag. He said you'd know what to do with it." Alina looked out over the delta, the gray water reflecting the gray sky. She felt a profound, heavy sense of responsibility. She held the lives of the 2nd Battalion in that envelope, and she held the power to destroy the men who had betrayed them. But she also knew that as soon as she moved, the Tahoe wouldn't just be following her. They would be coming to stop her. "Tell the first sergeant to stay quiet," Alina said. "Tell him I've got the lead." "He knows," Sarah replied. "He also said to tell you. The weight is yours now, surgeon, don't trip." Sarah walked away, her figure disappearing into the mist, leaving Alina alone with the evidence. She felt the tension in her hands, the specific, physical tension of a person who knows a disaster is coming and is the only one who can hear the clock ticking. She had the manifests. She had the mortar casing. But she needed one more thing. She needed to see the lab. She knew where Vanguard Solutions operated. They had a private testing range on the border of the Yakima Mining Center, a patch of land that was officially off-limits to military personnel, but was frequently used for joint agency drills. If she could get in there, if she could document the connection between the munitions and the contractor, she could end it. She rode back to her house, her mind a whirlwind of logistics and tactics. She needed Sila's. He was the only one who could get her onto the base after hours, and he was the only one who had seen the insurgents up close. But as she approached her street, she saw the blue Tahoe parked directly in front of her driveway. And this time, there were 2 of them. The door to her house was wide open. Alina didn't hesitate. She didn't go to the house. She turned the bike around and headed for the only other place she knew, the motor pool at JBLM. She knew the back gate, the one the night shift used when the sensors were down for maintenance. She moved with a dark competence, her body operating on autopilot, her mind narrowing until the only thing that existed was the mission. She reached the perimeter fence at 22:00. The rain had returned, a cold, persistent drizzle that blurred the lights of the base. She cut through the wire with a pair of pliers she had in her pack, her movements silent and efficient. She moved through the rows of parked strikers, the massive steel beasts looking like sleeping prehistoric animals in the dark. She found Silas in the back of the maintenance bay, hosing down a set of tires. He looked like a ghost, his skin pale and his eyes sunken. When he saw her, he nearly dropped the hose. "Sergeant, what are you doing here?" "They're looking for you. They put out a bolo, be on the lookout. They said you're mentally unstable, that you had a breakdown after the Yakima incident." "I'm fine, Silas," she said, her voice a cold whisper. "But they've been to my house. They know we have the casing." Silas slumped against a tire, his shoulders shaking. "It's over, isn't it? They're going to bury us." "No," Alina said, stepping into his space, her eyes locking onto his. "We're going to Yakima, tonight. I have the manifests. I know who did this, but I need to get to the Vanguard range, and I need a vehicle that isn't on their radar." Silas looked at her, then at the striker behind him. "I can get us a LMTV. The keys are in the lockbox and the duty officer is asleep in the break room, but we'll never get through the main gate." "We're not going through the gate," Alina said. "We're going through the fire break. The one we used during the training cycle. It's narrow, but the LMTV can handle it." The decision was made. It was the moment Alina crossed the line inside herself. She was no longer a soldier following orders. She was a woman pursuing justice at any cost. She felt a strange, terrifying sense of freedom. The institutional failure was complete, and she was the only thing left standing in the ruins. They moved quickly. Silas grabbed the keys and a pair of night vision goggles from the supply locker. Alina found her old medical kit in the back of the bay, the one Gathers had confiscated. It had been tossed in a pile of junk, the leather roll unspooled, the tools scattered. She gathered them up, her fingers moving with a frantic, desperate reverence. She didn't care if they were dirty. She didn't care if they were non-standard. They were hers. They loaded into the LMTV, a heavy, multi-purpose truck that felt like a tank on wheels. Silas took the wheel, his hands still shaking but his jaw set in a line of grim determination. Alina sat in the passenger seat, the manifests on her lap, the mortar casing between her boots. "You ready, Silas?" she asked as the engine roared to life. "No, Sergeant," he said, looking at the dark road ahead, "but I'm not leaving you." They drove out of the motor pool, staying in the shadows of the hangars. They hit the fire break at 23:30, the truck bouncing and swaying over the rutted, muddy track. The rain turned to sleet, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the slurry of ice and pine needles. The forest was a wall of blackness, the only light coming from the dim glow of the dashboard. For 2 hours, they moved through the wilderness, bypassing the sensors and the patrols. Alina watched the GPS, her mind calculating the distance to the Vanguard range. She could feel the tension rising in her chest, the specific physical weight of a person who is about to walk into a hornet's nest with nothing but a medical kit and a jagged piece of metal. Suddenly, Silas slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded in the mud, coming to a halt inches from a fallen log. In the glare of the headlights, Alina saw something that made her blood run cold. It was a roadblock, not a military one. 3 black SUVs, their engines idling, their light bars off. And standing in the middle of the road was a man in a dark tactical suit holding a thermal scanner. "They're here," Silas whispered, his voice trembling. "How did they know?" "The GPS," Alina said, her voice flat and cold. "The manifests, they were a trap." She looked at the man in the road. He wasn't an NCO, he wasn't a CID agent, he was a Vanguard operator, the same kind of man she had seen in the woods at Yakima. He raised a hand, gesturing for them to turn off the engine. Alina reached into her pack and pulled out the surgical-grade hemostat. She felt the weight of it, the cold, hard reality of the steel. She looked at Sila's, whose eyes were wide with a terror that surpassed anything he had felt in the trench. "Sila's," she said, her voice a low, melodic vow. "Do you remember what I told you in the kitchen? You said you had my back." "I still do," she said. "Now, when I say go, I want you to put this truck in reverse and don't stop until you hit the main road. I'm going out." "No, Sergeant, you can't." "It's not an order, Sila's," she said, her hand on the door handle. "It's a clinical necessity. They want me and they want the manifests. If I stay in the truck, we both die. If I go out, you have a chance to get the evidence to Miller's wife." She pushed the envelope into his hands. She didn't wait for his response. She opened the door and stepped out into the freezing sleet. The wind caught her hair, whipping it across her face, but she didn't blink. She stood in the mud, her back straight, her hands empty except for the small piece of steel in her pocket. The Vanguard operator stepped forward, the light from the SUVs casting his shadow long and jagged across the road. He didn't say a word. He just pointed his rifle at her chest. Elena looked at him, and for the first time in her life, she let the controlled rage through the ice. She wasn't afraid. She was the surgeon, and she was about to perform the most difficult procedure of her career. In the distance, she heard the faint, rhythmic thumping of a helicopter. Not a medevac. A private bird coming in low and fast from the north. The threat wasn't growing anymore, it was here. "Vance," the operator said, his voice a mechanical rasp through his comms. "Drop the bag and step away from the vehicle. We only want the manifests." Elena didn't move. She felt the cold rain soaking through her jacket, the smell of diesel and damp earth filling her lungs. She looked at the man, then at the dark woods behind him, and she knew what she had to do. "The manifests are already gone," she said, her voice carrying over the wind. "And so are you." She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the hemostat, her mind already mapping the vulnerabilities in the man's armor. She was 1 second away from acting, 1 second away from the explosion that would either save the 2nd Battalion or end her life. The helicopter swept over the trees, its spotlight cutting through the sleet like a white-hot blade, illuminating the road in a blinding, terrifying glare. Elena Vance took a breath, the cold air filling her lungs, and she didn't flinch. She was ready. The first round from the Vanguard operator's HK-416 didn't find Elena's chest. It shattered the LMTV passenger side mirror, showering the Yakima mud with 1,000 glittering shards of American-made glass at exactly 01:14 on a Thursday morning. The sound was a sharp, crystalline crack that cut through the low thrum of the idling diesel engine, followed immediately by the wet thud of the bullet burying itself in the heavy steel door. Elena didn't scream. She didn't dive for cover in a blind panic. She felt the sudden, hot sting of a glass splinter opening a tiny horizontal seam on her cheekbone, but her eyes never left the man in the tactical suit. Inside the cab, Silas let out a choked, ragged sound, half sob, half shout, and his hands gripped the steering wheel so hard the knuckles turned the color of bone. The world narrowed to the size of a surgical field. Elena's heart rate didn't spike into the red. It settled into a slow, rhythmic 68 beats per minute, the same steady pulse she maintained when she was deep in a man's thoracic cavity, fingers pinched around a leaking aorta. To Elena, the battlefield was just another body. The SUVs were the infection, the operators were the pathogens, and she was the surgeon tasked with the excision. "Reverse, Silas," she said, her voice a low, melodic anchor in the chaos. "Now." Silas didn't move. He was staring at the muzzle flash of the second shot, a strobe light burst in the sleet. The bullet skipped off the LMTV hood, whirring into the dark forest like a hornet. "Silas." Elena leaned back into the cab, her hand catching him hard on the shoulder, her fingers finding the specific pressure point near the trapezius that forced a neurological response. The sharp pain broke his paralysis. "Put it in R3 and floor it. Do not look back. If you stop, we're both casualties. Go." She didn't wait for him to acknowledge her. She stepped away from the truck, her boots sinking 3 inches into the freezing slurry of mud and ice. As the LMTV gears ground with a metallic shriek and the massive tires began to churn the earth, Elena moved. She didn't run like a soldier trained for a frontal assault. She moved with the lateral, predatory grace of a woman who understood the geometry of line of sight. The vanguard operator shifted his weight, his rifle tracking the retreating bulk of the truck. He was a professional, his movements economical and cold. He dismissed Alina for a split second, categorizing her as a non-combatant, a medic whose only weapon was a roll of gauze. It was a mistake that would have cost a less experienced man his life. Alina reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out the stainless steel hemostats. They were 6 inches of German-engineered precision, the tips serrated for a grip that did not slip. She didn't have a rifle. She didn't have a plate carrier. But she had an intimate, map-like knowledge of the human nervous system and a darkness in her that the army had spent 12 years trying to institutionalize. She hit the ditch at the edge of the fire break, the freezing water soaking into her OCPs, the weight of the wet fabric pulling at her limbs. She didn't feel the cold. She felt the trajectory of the helicopter, the MD-500 Defender, as it banked low over the ridgeline. The spotlight swept across the mud, a white-hot eye looking for the manifests. The first operator stepped toward the ditch, his boots crunching on the frozen hemlock needles. He was 5 yards away. 4. Alina could smell the scent of CLP gun oil and the stale, artificial tang of an energy drink. She waited. She wasn't looking at his face. She was looking at the gap between his ballistic helmet and his tactical vest, the vulnerable column of the carotid and the jugular. He peered into the shadows, the thermal scanner on his rail glowing a faint, ghostly green. He saw her heat signature a second too late. Alina exploded upward. She didn't lead with a punch or a kick. She led with the hemostats. As the operator began to swing his rifle around, she drove the steel tips into the soft tissue just below his ear, plunging them 2 inches deep and then clamping them shut with a sickening metallic click. He didn't scream. The clamp had crushed the laryngeal nerve and severed the internal jugular. His rifle fired once, the round harmlessly striking the mud, before his body went slack. She caught him as he fell, her hands moving with a clinical efficiency to guide his weight so he didn't splash into the water. She stripped the HK-416 from his hands in one fluid motion, her fingers finding the safety and flipping it to semi-auto. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel horror. She felt the specific, cold relief of a procedure beginning to go according to plan. "One down," she whispered to the freezing wind. Above her, the helicopter's spotlight caught the LMTV as it skidded sideways, its rear tires losing purchase on the slick incline of the fire break. Sila's was screaming now. She could hear it over the roar of the rotors, a high, thin sound of pure animal terror. The pilot shifted the bird, the nose dipping as the door gunner prepared to engage. They weren't going to let the truck reach the main road. They were going to core it like an apple. Alina didn't think about the cost. She didn't think about the fact that she was now a murderer in the eyes of the law, a rogue NCO who had just killed a private security contractor. She thought about Miller's leg. She thought about the mortar casing. She thought about the boy she had held together with nothing but her bare hands and a prayer. She raised the HK-416, the stock cold against her cheek. She didn't aim for the pilot. The MD-500 had armored glass, and a .56 round would just spiderweb the surface. She aimed for the Jesus nut, the main rotor mast nut that held the entire assembly together. It was a small target, no larger than a grapefruit, vibrating at thousands of revolutions per minute, visible only for a fraction of a second as the bird banked. She waited for the intake of breath. She waited for the moment between heartbeats. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, 3 rounds, fired in a rapid, rhythmic cadence. One hit the fuselage. One vanished into the dark. The third struck the edge of the rotor assembly with a bright, orange spark. It wasn't enough to bring the bird down, but it was enough to make the pilot flinch. The spotlight jerked away from the LMTV, sweeping across the tree line, blinded by the sudden muzzle flash from the ditch. "Go, Silas!" She yelled, though there was no way he could hear her. The LMTV found grip. The massive tires bit into the gravel of an old logging spur, and the truck lunged forward, disappearing into the thick canopy of Douglas firs. Sela's was clear, for now. But Alina was not. The second SUV had moved up, and two more operators were bailing out, their movements fast and synchronized. They knew where she was now. They had seen the flash. They began to leapfrog toward her position, suppressing the ditch with disciplined, two-round bursts. The air above her head was a swarm of lead, the bullets shredding the hemlock branches and sending a rain of needles and bark down onto her back. She rolled to her left, moving through the freezing water of the drainage pipe that ran under the fire break. The space was barely 18 inches wide, a concrete tube filled with silt and the smell of stagnant rot. She crawled, the HK-416 scraping against the ceiling, her breath coming in short, controlled puffs. The physical cost was beginning to register. Her left shoulder, the one that had taken the impact of the fall into the ditch, was screaming. A jagged heat was radiating from the joint, a signal that she had likely torn the labrum or dislocated it slightly. She ignored it. Pain was just data. Pain was a symptom. It wasn't a diagnosis. She emerged on the other side of the fire break, 50 yards from the SUVs. The operators were still focused on the ditch, their thermal optics struggling with the heat bloom from the first man's cooling body and the steam rising from the water. Alina took the moment to triage her surroundings. The MD-500 was circling back, its searchlight cutting a wide swath through the woods. To her right, the ridge rose steeply, a wall of basalt and scree. To her left, the creek bed led down toward the valley floor, thick, impenetrable brush. She needed to disable the vehicles. If she didn't, they would catch Sela's within 10 miles. The LMTV was heavy and slow, the SUVs were built for pursuit. She looked at the lead SUV, a blacked-out Chevy Suburban. The engine was still running, the exhaust a pale plume in the cold air. She remembered the manifests, Vanguard Solutions. They were testers. They were experimental. And that meant their vehicles were likely running on high-performance, pressurized fuel systems to handle the mountain grades. She didn't use the rifle. She reached into her medical kit, her fingers finding a small, orange plastic tube, a specialized flare used for marking LZs in high-wind conditions. It burned at 2,000 degrees, hot enough to melt through an engine block. She began to move, staying low, using the basalt outcrops for cover. Every movement sent a fresh jolt of agony through her shoulder, a sickening grind of bone on bone. She bit her lip until she tasted copper, her eyes fixed on the Suburban. She was 20 feet away when the MD-500 light found her. The world turned white. The roar of the rotors was a physical weight, pressing down on her, the downdraft whipping the sleet into a blinding frenzy. The door gunner opened up, the M249 SAW spitting a stream of tracers that chewed the ground around her feet. Alina didn't run. She didn't hide. She stood up. In the middle of the storm, in the center of the impossible, she looked up at the helicopter. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a target. She was the surgeon, and she had just found the vein. She threw the flare. It wasn't a desperate toss, it was a calculated, overhand strike, aimed at the air intake of the lead SUV. The orange tube tumbled through the air, trailing a streak of magnesium fire. It struck the grill, bounced once, and vanished into the engine compartment. 3 seconds later, the pressurized fuel line cooked off. The explosion wasn't a movie-style fireball. It was a sharp, concussive crump that lifted the front end of the 3-ton vehicle off the ground. A jet of blue-white flame geysered through the hood, spraying burning fuel across the second SUV parked behind it. The heat was instantaneous, a wall of blistering energy that singed Alina's eyebrows and forced the operators to scramble back. The helicopter pilot, startled by the sudden inferno beneath him, pulled pitch too hard. The bird lurched upward, the tail rotor clipping the top of a dead cedar tree. The sound was a horrific, metallic shriek, the sound of a machine dying. The tail rotor disintegrated, sending shrapnel whistling through the air like saw blades. The MD-500 began to spin. It was a slow, graceful rotation at first, a ballet of failing physics. Then it picked up speed, the centrifugal force throwing the door gunner out into the dark. The bird slammed into the basalt ridge 100 yards away, the rotors shattering against the rock, the fuel tank igniting in a secondary bloom of orange light that illuminated the entire valley. Silence followed. Not a true silence, but the ringing, hollow quiet that follows a massive trauma. The only sound was the crackle of the burning SUVs and the distant, fading rumble of the LMTV. Elena collapsed against a tree, her legs finally giving out. Her shoulder was no longer just painful, it was a dead weight, the arm hanging at a useless, unnatural angle. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking, not with fear, but with the massive, systemic shock of what she had just done. She had taken down a contractor team. She had destroyed millions of dollars of equipment. She had crossed a line that no amount of metals or service time could ever erase. She heard a moan from the direction of the fire break. One of the operators was still alive. He was crawling away from the burning Suburban, his tactical suit melted to his skin, his breath a wet, rattling gasp. Elena watched him. She could feel the controlled rage flickering in her chest, the urge to finish what she had started, to let the fire take him the way the fire had taken the boys in the trench. He was the enemy, he was the pathogen, but as she looked at him, she didn't see an operator. She saw a patient. She forced herself to stand, her vision swimming with gray spots. She staggered toward him, her boots heavy with mud, her breath hitching in her chest. She reached him and knelt down, her good hand reaching for her med kit. Don't touch me," the man rasped, his eyes wide with a combination of agony and terror. He looked at her like she was a ghost, a vengeful spirit born of the mud and the sleet. "Be quiet," Elena said, her voice shifting back into the clinical, authoritative tone of the surgeon. "You have third-degree burns over 40% of your body. You're going into hypovolemic shock. If I don't stabilize you, you'll be dead before the sun comes up." "Why?" The man choked out, a line of black blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. We were supposed to kill you." Elena didn't answer. She pulled a bag of Hextend from her kit, her fingers moving with a practiced, muscle memory precision despite the tremor. She hung the bag from a low branch, spiked the line, and began to look for a vein in his unburned arm. "Because," she said, her voice flat and cold, "I'm a medic. And unlike your bosses, I don't decide who lives and dies based on a balance sheet." She worked in the flickering light of the burning SUVs, a lone woman in the middle of a graveyard of steel and glass. She treated him with the same care, the same focus she had given Miller. She debrided the worst of the burns, she administered the morphine, she wrapped him in a thermal blanket she had pulled from his own pack. She was halfway through the procedure when her burner phone buzzed. She didn't look at it until the man's pulse had stabilized and his breathing had evened out. She sat back on her heels, the freezing rain washing the soot from her face. She pulled the phone from her pocket. Asterisk package delivered. Miller's wife has the manifests. "Get out of there, surgeon. They're sending a second team from McCord. Ida 20 minutes. Asterisk it was Sela's. He had made it. The evidence was moving. The clock was still ticking, but for the first time in 48 hours, it wasn't ticking toward her defeat. Elena looked at the man she had just saved. He was unconscious now, his face a mask of trauma. She looked at the burning wreckage of the MD 500. She looked at the HK 416 lying in the mud. She stood up, her body feeling 100 years old. She knew she couldn't stay. She couldn't be there when the second team arrived. She had to disappear, to find a way back into the shadows before the institutional reckoning began. She turned and began to walk toward the ridge, her left arm tucked into her jacket like a makeshift sling. She moved slowly, every step a triumph of will over physics. She didn't look back. The cost was already mounting. She was a fugitive. She was injured. She had lost her career, her home, her identity. But as she climbed the basalt ridge, looking out over the dark, rain-swept expanse of the Yakima Valley, she felt a strange, quiet sense of hope. The truth was out. The infection had been exposed. And though the surgery was far from over, the first incision had been made. She reached the top of the ridge just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky. The rain had turned to a light, powdery snow, dusting the blackened remains of the firebreak in a clean, white shroud. Alina leaned against a rock, her breath a pale mist in the air. In the distance, she heard the faint, high-pitched whine of sirens, the local authorities, or perhaps the 2nd Vanguard team. It didn't matter. She had a 10-minute lead, and in the woods of the Pacific Northwest, 10 minutes was a lifetime for a woman who knew how to disappear. She looked down at her right hand. It was stained with the man's blood, the copper scent still strong. She wiped it on her trousers, a slow, deliberate movement. "The weight is mine," she whispered, the words a promise to the men she had saved and the men she had lost. She turned and vanished into the timber, a shadow among shadows, leaving the wreckage and the fire behind. The reckoning was coming. She could feel it in the air, a gathering storm of court-martials, hearings, and lies. But she wasn't afraid of the storm. She was the one who had started it. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and cold. Alina moved through the fascia of the forest, staying off the trails, using the deep ravines and the thickets of vine maple to mask her trail. She knew the trackers would be looking for a soldier, someone moving with a standard tactical footprint, so she moved like a hunter. She stayed on the rocky ground where her boots left no prints. She moved through the creek beds to mask her scent from the dogs. At 05:00, she found a small, abandoned trapper's cabin 5 miles from the firebreak. It was a rotting shell of cedar and moss. The roof caved in on one side, but it was dry. She crawled inside, her body finally demanding its due. The adrenaline had long since evaporated, leaving her with a cold, hollow exhaustion that felt like it was hollowing out her bones. She sat in the corner, her back against the damp wood, and pulled her medical kit into her lap. She had to fix the shoulder. If she didn't, she wouldn't make it another 5 miles. She took a deep breath, the air whistling in her lungs. She reached into her kit and pulled out a bottle of antiseptic and a clean field dressing. She didn't have any anesthesia left. She had used the last of the morphine on the Vanguard operator. She bit down on a piece of leather from her pack. She gripped a sturdy wooden post with her good hand. She visualized the anatomy of the shoulder, the humeral head, the glenoid cavity, the labrum. She saw the misalignment in her mind's eye. She shifted her weight, braced her feet against the wall, and threw her body forward with a violent, controlled jerk. The sound of the joint popping back into place was a wet, sickening thud that echoed in the small cabin. Alina's world went white. The pain was an explosion, a blinding white-hot flare that threatened to take her consciousness. She didn't scream, but a low, guttural moan escaped her lips, muffled by the leather. She slumped back against the wall, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She waited for the stars to fade from her vision. 10 minutes passed. 20. Slowly, the agonizing grind of bone on bone was replaced by a dull, throbbing ache. It wasn't fixed, but it was functional. She wrapped the shoulder in a tight figure-8 bandage, using her teeth to tighten the knot. She felt a grim sense of satisfaction. She had performed the surgery on herself. She had triaged the damage and implemented the fix. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, letting the silence of the woods wash over her. She thought about her father. She thought about the Missouri hills. She thought about the grandfather clock in her hallway in Steilacoom, ticking away in a house she might never see again. Still standing, she whispered to the darkness. But the silence didn't last. At 06:30, her burner phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a call. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the accept button. If she answered, they could triangulate her position. But if she didn't, she was blind. She answered. "Vance," a voice said. It wasn't Sela's. It wasn't Sarah Miller. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 5 years. A voice that belonged to the man who had trained her, the man who had taught her that the mission was the only thing that mattered. "Colonel Vance," the voice said, using her father's rank and her name in a way that felt like a slap. "Major Thorne," Alina said, her voice steady and cold. Thorne was the head of special projects at McCord. He was the man who had signed the contracts with Vanguard. He was the architect of the betrayal. "You've caused a lot of trouble tonight, Alina," Thorne said, his voice smooth and professional, as if they were discussing a logistical error in a briefing room. 2 SUVs destroyed, a multi-million-dollar airframe lost, 3 contractors in the ICU. It's a mess. The mess started in Yakima, Major, Alina replied. It started when you decided to use your own soldiers as guinea pigs for a private munitions test. It started when you left Miller to die in that trench. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Alina could hear the faint hum of a command center in the background, the click of keyboards, the low murmur of analysts. They were tracking her. She knew it. She had maybe 5 minutes before the birds were in the air. "The world isn't as simple as you want it to be, Sergeant," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave. "We need those munitions. We need the data. The next war won't be fought with M4s and old-school tactics. It'll be fought with the gear Vanguard is developing. A few casualties in training are a small price to pay for 1,000 lives saved on the front line. And not when you're the one holding the scalpel," Alina said. "And not when you're lying to the families of the men you broke. You didn't save lives, Thorne. You sold them. Where are the manifests, Alina? They're where you can't reach them," she said. "The story is already moving. By noon today, the IG and the press will have everything. The lot numbers, the signatures, the flight logs, you're done." Thorne laughed, a short, dry sound that had no humor in it. "You're an optimist. I've always liked that about you. But you're also a fugitive. You've killed people, Alina. You've stolen military property. You're mentally unstable, remember? That's what the report will say. And who are they going to believe? A decorated major with 20 years of service or a broken medic who had a psychotic break in the woods? They'll believe the truth," Alina said, "because the truth doesn't need a rank to be heard." "We'll see," Thorne said. "I'm sending the recovery team now. Don't make it harder than it has to be. Just stay where you are and come in quietly. We can still handle this internally." "Internal is how you hide things, Major," Alina said. "I'm going public." She ended the call and pulled the battery from the phone, dropping it into the dirt. She didn't have 5 minutes. She had 3. She stood up, her shoulder throbbing with every heartbeat. She grabbed her pack and the HK 416. She looked at the cabin one last time. It was a tomb for a life she no longer lived. She stepped out into the snow, the cold air hitting her face like a physical blow. The world was white and silent, a blank canvas waiting for the next move. She began to run, her boots crunching on the frozen crust of the snow, her mind focused on the only thing that mattered now: survival. She wasn't just running from Thorne. She was running toward the reckoning. She was running toward the moment when she would have to stand in front of the world and tell them what she had seen. She was running toward the cost. And as she moved through the trees, the gray light of morning illuminating the path ahead, Alina Vance felt a strange, dark sense of competence return to her. She was no longer the surgeon in the trench. She was the surgeon in the theater of war, and the operation had only just begun. She reached the edge of the timber, where the ridge dropped away into a steep, rocky gorge. Below her, a river raged, a torrent of white water and gray stone. On the other side of the gorge, a narrow, logging road wound its way toward the highway. She looked back. In the distance, she could see the black shapes of 2 Black Hawk helicopters rising over the trees, their rotors beating a rhythmic, predatory tattoo against the sky. They were coming. Alina looked at the gorge. It was a 50-foot drop into freezing water. The odds were impossible. The current was too fast, the rocks too sharp, the water too cold. A rational person would have turned back. A rational person would have surrendered. But Alina Vance wasn't a rational person. She was a woman who had spent 12 years fixing things that were broken. And she knew that sometimes, to fix something, you had to break it even further. She adjusted the pack on her shoulders. She tightened the bandage on her arm. She took a deep, steady breath, the cold air filling her lungs, her heart rate settling into that familiar, slow rhythm. "The weight is mine," she whispered. And then, without a moment's hesitation, she stepped off the edge. The fall was a blur of gray rock and white mist. The impact with the water was a concussive shock that drove the air from her lungs and sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated agony through her shoulder. The cold was an instant, paralyzing force, 1,000 needles of ice pressing into her skin. She vanished beneath the surface, the current grabbing her and dragging her down into the dark. For a second, there was only the roar of the water and the silence of the deep. Then a hand broke the surface. Elena Vance caught a branch, her fingers clawing at the bark, her good arms straining against the weight of the current. She pulled herself up, her face breaking the water, her breath coming in a jagged, desperate gasp. She was alive. She was freezing, she was broken, and she was alone. But she was still standing. She pulled herself onto the rocky bank, her body shaking so hard she could barely move. She looked up at the sky. The Blackhawks were hovering over the ridge, their spotlights searching the woods where she had been. They were looking for a soldier. They were looking for a body. They weren't looking for the woman in the river. Elena crawled into the brush, her movements slow and agonizing. She found a hollow under a fallen cedar and pulled herself inside, the thick branches offering a small measure of protection from the wind and the snow. She lay there, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against the cold earth. She had survived the crossing. She had survived the action. She had paid the cost in blood and bone and career. The reckoning was coming. The institutional machinery was already turning, preparing to crush her under the weight of its lies. But as Elena Vance lay in the dark, the sound of the river a constant roar in her ears, she knew something that Thorne and the men like him would never understand. The truth didn't belong to the command group. It didn't belong to the contractors. It belonged to the people who were willing to bleed for it, and Elena Vance was still bleeding. She closed her eyes, the darkness of the hollow swallowing her. She didn't sleep. She waited. She waited for the sun to rise. She waited for the next move. She waited for the moment when the surgeon would finish the job. The immediate aftermath was a blur of gray and white. The Blackhawk circled for another hour before banking back toward McCord. The woods returned to their silent, frozen state. The snow continued to fall, a clean, white shroud covering the path she had taken. Elena stayed in the hollow, her body temperature dropping, her mind drifting in and out of a cold, feverish haze. She saw Miller's face. She saw the mortar casing. She saw the man she had treated in the mud. "Still standing," she whispered, her voice a ghost in the wind. The crisis had passed. The immediate threat was gone. But the reckoning, institutional, personal, physical, was only just beginning. Elena knew it. The reader knew it. The world would soon know it. As the first true light of day touched the tops of the Douglas firs, Elena Vance pulled herself out of the hollow. She was a woman without a unit, a medic without a kit, a soldier without a home. But as she stood on the bank of the river, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, she looked like the most powerful person in the world. She was the truth. And the truth was coming home. The state trooper who found Sergeant Elena Vance walking along the shoulder of Highway 12 at 07:42 did not see a fugitive or a hero. He saw a ghost covered in the gray silt of the Titan River. He didn't pull his service weapon when he saw the HK 416 slung across her back, its muzzle clogged with frozen mud. He simply turned on his lights, the blue and red strobes reflecting off the wall of Douglas firs, and watched as the woman stopped, closed her eyes, and let the rifle slide from her shoulder to the asphalt with a heavy metallic clatter. She didn't put her hands up. She didn't kneel. She just stood there in the freezing rain, her breathing shallow and rhythmic, waiting for the machinery of the world she had served to finally catch up with her. By noon, the quiet isolation of the Yakima woods was replaced by the aggressive, sterile hum of an interrogation room in the basement of the CID headquarters at Joint Base Lewis McChord. The room smelled of industrial floor wax and the stale, burnt sugar scent of coffee that had been sitting in a communal pot since the change of shift. Elena sat in a metal chair bolted to the floor, her left arm immobilized in a standard issue medical sling, her OCPs replaced by a pair of oversized, rough-textured orange coveralls. They had taken her boots, they had taken her rank, they had taken her pride, or so they thought, but as she stared at the one-way glass, her eyes remained as calm and unreadable as the surface of a mountain lake. Across from her sat Special Agent Miller, no relation to the boy she had tried to save, a man who wore his suit with the uncomfortable stiffness of a career soldier trying to pass as a civilian. He didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. He just flipped through a thick manila folder, the sound of the paper snapping like small bones in the silence of the room. He was looking for a crack. He was looking for the psychotic break Major Thorne had promised him in the preliminary report. He found nothing but a woman whose heart rate, monitored by the discreet sensor on the table's edge, remained a steady, defiant 64 beats per minute. "Sergeant Vance," Miller finally said, his voice low and practiced, "I've spent the last 4 hours looking at the wreckage on that fire break. I've seen the bodies. I've seen what's left of an MD 500 that costs the American taxpayer about $4 million. And I've seen the report from Major Thorne stating that you abandoned your post, stole sensitive equipment, and engaged in a series of unauthorized, violent encounters with civilian contractors." He leaned forward, the fluorescent lights overhead glinting off his wedding band. "The Major says you're suffering from acute PTSD-induced paranoia. He says you think the Army is trying to kill its own people. He says you're a danger to yourself and others." Alina didn't blink. She watched the way his pupils dilated slightly when he mentioned the money. To Miller, the cost was measured in line items and airframe values. To her, the cost was the smell of copper in the rain and the way Miller's namesake had looked at her when he realized his legs were gone. "Is that what the Major says?" Alina asked. Her voice was a dry rasp, the vocal cords still recovering from the river's ice, but the control was absolute. It wasn't the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a surgeon giving a status report in a crowded ER. "That's the official narrative," Miller said, sliding a photograph across the table. It was a shot of the burned-out Suburban, the magnesium flare's path still visible as a charred streak across the grill. "But I've been doing this for 15 years, Alina, and I've never seen a psychotic soldier use a medical hemostat to take out a Vanguard operator with surgical precision. Psychotics are messy. They are loud. They don't triage their enemies before they kill them. They don't perform field surgery on a man who was sent to terminate them. So, I'm going to ask you once and only once, what is actually in those manifests?" The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that settled into the corners of the room. Alina looked at the photograph. She thought about the weight of the paper in Sarah Miller's hands. She thought about Sela's, who was currently being held in a separate wing, likely being told that Alina had already confessed to everything. The institution was moving now, its gears grinding to protect the hierarchy, to protect the contracts, to protect the men who sat in leather chairs and moved pawns across maps of the Pacific Northwest. The manifests contain the truth about the Block 4 kinetic penetrators. Alina said, her words deliberate and sharp. They contain the signatures of Major Thorne and the Vanguard Board of Directors authorizing live-fire tests on unsuspecting units in the Yakima Training Center. They contain the lot numbers of the munitions that failed in the trench. They are the record of a crime, Agent Miller, not a mistake, a crime. Miller didn't answer, he didn't have to. The door behind him opened and a man in a class uniform stepped into the room. It wasn't Thorne. It was Colonel Holloway, the base legal counsel, a woman whose face was a mask of cold, bureaucratic efficiency. She didn't look at Alina. She looked at Miller, and the look said everything. "Agent Miller, this interview is concluded," Holloway said. "The sergeant is being transferred to the brig at Naval Base Kitsap. Pre-trial confinement. General court-martial charges are being drafted as we speak. Murder, sabotage, theft of government property, desertion in a time of heightened readiness." "Colonel, we haven't even finished the preliminary statement," Miller protested, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew how the wind was blowing. "The statement is irrelevant," Holloway replied, finally turning her gaze to Alina. It was a look of profound disappointment, the way a parent looks at a child who has destroyed a family heirloom. Sergeant Vance has chosen her path. She has decided that her personal insights outweigh the chain of command and the security of the United States Army. The Army will now respond in kind. As they led Alina out of the room, her hands cuffed behind her back, she passed a window that looked out over the parade ground. The flag was at half-mast. For Miller, for the contractors, or for the idea of the service itself. She didn't know. But as she was pushed into the back of a blacked-out transport van, she saw a lone figure standing by the gate. It was Sarah Miller. She was wearing her husband's oversized field jacket, her face pale and set, her eyes locked on the van. She didn't wave. She didn't cry. She just touched the pocket where the manifests were hidden, a small, subtle gesture that only Alina would recognize. The weight was no longer Alina's alone, but the cost was only beginning to be tallied. The drive to Kitsap was 3 hours of sensory deprivation. The van was windowless, the air inside thick with the smell of old upholstery and the hum of a high-end GPS jammer. Alina sat in the dark, her mind moving through the surgery of the coming weeks. She knew the procedure for a court-martial. She knew how they would strip her down. They would bring in experts to talk about her unstable childhood in Missouri, her obsession with trauma medicine, her difficulty with male authority figures. They would take her 12 years of perfect service and turn them into a prologue for a mental collapse. They would make her the pathogen. When she arrived at the naval brig, the reception was different than CID. The Navy didn't care about the politics of the Army. To the guards at Kitsap, she was just another high-value prisoner, a problem child to be managed with a minimum of fuss. They processed her in silence. The cold water of the shower, the rough towel, the smell of antiseptic soap that reminded her too much of the hospitals she had loved. They put her in a 6x9 cell with a concrete bunk and a stainless steel toilet. No windows, just a heavy steel door with a sliding meal slot and the constant, low-frequency hum of the ventilation system. She lay on the bunk, her left shoulder throbbing with a rhythmic, pulsing heat. The self-reduction of the dislocation had been successful, but the soft tissue was a mess. She needed an MRI, she needed physical therapy, she needed a surgeon. But she knew she would get none of those things. She was in the hole. She was being managed. On the second day, the door opened. It wasn't a guard. It was Major Thorne. He looked different without the tactical gear. He wore his dress blues, the medals on his chest, a glittering array of valor and service that Alina knew were mostly earned in air-conditioned offices. He looked at the small cell with a faint expression of distaste, as if the poverty of her surroundings was a personal affront to his rank. "You look tired, Alina," he said, pulling a folding stool from the hallway and sitting just outside the threshold of the cell. He didn't enter. He stayed in the light. Alina didn't sit up. She stayed on her side, her eyes fixed on the gray concrete wall. "I've had worse nights," she said. "I'm sure you have," Thorne replied. "The Yakima Trench, the core angle, you've always had a high threshold for suffering. It's what made you such a good medic. But this is a different kind of pain. This isn't a bullet wound you can pack with gauze. This is the end of everything you've ever been." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The manifests are gone, Alina. We found the woman. Sarah Miller. She was very cooperative once we explained the legal ramifications of withholding classified military documents. We have the papers, we have the files. Your truth is currently being shredded in a high-security facility at Fort Belvoir." Alina felt a cold spike of fear in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. She knew Thorne was lying. If he had the manifests, he wouldn't be here. He would be at a golf course, celebrating his promotion. He was fishing. He was trying to see if she had copies, if she had a backup plan. "Then why are you here, Major?" she asked, finally turning her head to look at him. "If the evidence is gone, I'm just a crazy sergeant in a box. Why waste the gas to drive to Kitsap?" Thorne's jaw tightened. The controlled rage Alina had felt in the woods was now reflected in the man across from her, but his was the rage of an ego that had been bruised, not a heart that had been broken. "Because I don't like loose ends," he said, "and because I want you to understand something. This isn't a movie. There is no last-minute rescue. There is no heroic whistleblower moment. In 48 hours, the board will convene. They will hear from the psychiatrists. They will hear from the surviving Vanguard operators who will testify that you fired first. They will hear that Silas was under duress and that you forced him to drive that truck. Silas won't lie for you, Alina said. Silas is a specialist with 2 kids and a mortgage, Thorne countered. He's been told that if he cooperates, he keeps his pension and his honorable discharge. If he doesn't, he goes to Leavenworth as your accomplice. What do you think he's going to choose, Alina? Loyalty to a woman he's known for 3 days, or the life he's spent 10 years building? Alina closed her eyes. She saw Silas in the cab of the LMTV, his hands shaking, his voice a ragged sob. She knew what he would choose. She wanted him to choose it. She didn't want his blood on her hands, too. Go away, Thorne, she said. I'm giving you a way out, Thorne said, ignoring her. A psychiatric discharge. Other than honorable, you walk away, you go back to Missouri, you never speak of this again, no court-martial. No prison time, just silence. And the munitions? Alina asked. The Block 4s, you'll just keep testing them on the boys in the 4th Brigade? Thorne stood up, his face hardening into a mask of pure institutional resolve. The tests were a success, Alina. The data we gathered from that trench will save 10,000 lives in the next conflict. That is the nature of progress. It requires sacrifice. Usually, the people being sacrificed don't get to have an opinion on it. He kicked the stool back into the hallway. Think about the offer. You have until tomorrow morning. After that, the machinery starts, and not even I can stop it. He left, the heavy steel door slamming shut with a sound that felt like the lid of a coffin closing. Alina lay in the dark, the silence of the cell pressing in on her. She felt the weight of the cost settling in. She had lost Silas. She had potentially lost Sarah Miller. She had lost her career. And for what? For a truth that was being erased one document at a time. But as she lay there, she felt something else. A small, persistent flicker of hope. She remembered the way Sarah Miller had touched her pocket. She remembered the specific weight of the manifests. There hadn't just been paper in those folders. There had been a thumb drive, taped to the inside of the back cover, an encrypted backup of the telemetry data from the Vanguard drones. Alina hadn't told anyone about it, not Silas, not even Sarah. She had planted a drainage tube in the evidence, and Thorne was too arrogant to realize he was still bleeding. The 3rd day in the brig brought the physical reckoning. The adrenaline that had sustained Alina through the woods and the interrogation had finally, irrevocably burned out. Her body was entering a state of systemic collapse. Her temperature spiked to 103, her lungs crackled with the beginning of pneumonia from the river water, and her shoulder had swollen to the size of a grapefruit, the skin a mottled, angry purple. She didn't call for the guard. She didn't ask for a doctor. She lay on the concrete floor, the coolness of the stone the only relief she could find. She was drifting, her mind sliding back to her father's workshop in the Ozarks, the smell of cedar shavings and the sound of the wind in the pines. She saw him standing over a broken tractor, his hands covered in grease, his face set in that look of quiet, stubborn competence. If it's worth fixing, Alina, it's worth fixing right, he had said. The quick fix is just a lie you tell yourself until the machine breaks for good. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Not Thorne's hand, not a guard's hand. This hand was gentle, the touch light and professional. Sergeant Vance, can you hear me? Alina forced her eyes open. The world was a blur of white light and gray shadows. A woman was kneeling beside her, wearing a white lab coat over a Navy uniform. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins, the brig's chief medical officer. She wasn't part of the CID investigation. She wasn't part of the command structure at McCord. She was just a doctor. Your vitals are a mess, Sergeant, Jenkins said, her voice low and urgent. You have a pleural effusion in your left lung and a grade 3 tear in your labrum. You should be in a hospital, not a hole. I'm fine, Alina rasped, her voice barely a whisper. You're not fine, you're dying, Jenkins said. She looked back at the door where the guard was standing, his back turned. She leaned closer to Alina's ear. I read your file, Sergeant, not the one Thorne sent. Your real file, the one from the 10th Mountain. My brother was in that valley in the Coringle. He's the one whose femoral artery you clamped with a pair of pliers while the ridge was being overrun. Alina's vision cleared for a second. She looked at the doctor, seeing the resemblance now, the same stubborn jaw, the same clear, honest eyes. "He's a high school teacher now," Jenkins whispered. "He has a daughter because of you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, plastic cup of water and 2 tablets. "Take these. They're high-dose antibiotics and a non-narcotic anti-inflammatory. I can't get you out of here, not yet, but I can keep you alive until the hearing." They'll come for you too," Elena said, her fingers trembling as she took the cup. "Let them come," Jenkins said, a flash of that controlled rage appearing in her eyes. "The medical corps doesn't take orders from Vanguard Solutions. You're my patient, Sergeant, and in this room, my authority is absolute." For the first time in 4 days, Elena felt the weight lift, just a fraction. She wasn't alone. The institution was a monster, a blind, grinding machine of policy and profit, but it was made of people. And some of those people still remembered what the uniform was supposed to mean. The reckoning for the authority figures was happening, too, though Elena couldn't see it. In a windowless conference room at Joint Base Lewis McChord, the big army was beginning to wake up. Major Thorne sat at the end of a long mahogany table, surrounded by 3-star generals and corporate lobbyists. The mood was not celebratory. "The PR firm is saying we can't bury the Yakima story," a man in a civilian suit said, his voice taut with stress. "The local news in Seattle is already asking questions about the training accident on Highway 12, and someone, we don't know who, just sent a series of encrypted files to the Senate Armed Services Committee." Thorne felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. "The files are corrupted," he said, his voice lacking its usual smoothness. "We've already neutralized the primary evidence. The sergeant is in custody. The driver is cooperating. It's a closed loop." "It doesn't look like a closed loop, Major," a general said, his voice like the low growl of a distant storm. "It looks like a clusterfuck. We have a decorated medic being held in a naval brig without a formal charge, a dead corporal whose family is calling their congressman every hour, and a private contractor whose employees are currently in the ICU at Madigan claiming they were attacked by a special forces operator who turns out to be a 5'8" woman with a medic's badge." The general leaned forward, his eyes boring into Thorne's. "If this goes south, Major, the Army isn't going to protect Vanguard. And it sure as hell isn't going to protect you. We're going to look for a fall guy. And right now, you're the only one standing in the center of the target." Thorne looked around the room. He saw the faces of the men he had served, the men he had lied for, the men he had thought were his allies. He saw the calculation in their eyes. They were triaging the situation. They were looking for the limb that needed to be amputated to save the body. He was the infection now. Back in the brig, the hours bled into a single, long night of fever and shadow. Elena slept in fits and starts, her mind a kaleidoscope of memories and pain. She saw the face of the man she had saved in the woods, the Vanguard operator. She wondered if he was still alive. She wondered if he knew that the woman who had crushed his throat was the same woman who had saved his life. At 03:00 on the 5th day, the cell door opened again. This time, it wasn't Thorne. It wasn't Jenkins. It was Sila's. He was dressed in his class a uniform, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He looked like he hadn't slept since the river. He was accompanied by a Navy JAG officer, a young lieutenant with a briefcase and a look of grim determination. "Elena," Sila said, his voice cracking. He stepped into the cell and knelt beside her bunk. I'm so sorry. Did you sign it?" Elena asked, her voice a ghost of its former self. "I signed the statement they gave me," Silas whispered, his head bowed. "I told them you were the one who authorized the move. I told them you were the one who engaged the contractors." Elena reached out with her good hand, her fingers brushing his arm. "Good, you did the right thing, Silas. You have a family, you have a life. But I didn't give them the drive," Silas said, looking up. There was a spark of something in his eyes, a small, defiant flame that the institution hadn't been able to snuff out. "Sarah Miller, she didn't have the manifests, Elena. I did. I switched the folders before I left her house. The one Thorne took." It was a collection of old motor pool requisitions and empty flight logs. The real manifests, the drive, there with the JAG. He gestured to the lieutenant standing in the doorway. "Lieutenant Vance, no relation," the officer said with a small, tight smile. "I'm your defense counsel, Sergeant, and I think it's time we discussed your countersuit against Vanguard Solutions and the United States Army for criminal negligence, conspiracy to commit murder, and the unauthorized testing of experimental munitions on active-duty personnel." Alina felt a strange, lightheaded sensation. It wasn't the fever. It was the sudden, violent shift of the world on its axis. The surgery was working. The infection was being exposed. The cost had been paid, but the recovery was finally beginning. "The weight," Alina whispered, her eyes filling with tears she had held back for a lifetime. "It's not just mine." "No, Sergeant," the JAG officer said, stepping into the room and opening his briefcase. "The weight belongs to the people who earned it, and we're going to make sure they feel every ounce of it." But the victory was far from certain. As the lieutenant began to spread the documents across the small concrete bunk, the sound of a helicopter approaching the brig echoed through the ventilation system. Not a transport bird, not a medevac, the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a Black Hawk. The institution was coming for its final reckoning. The door to the cell block slammed open, and the sound of heavy boots echoed down the hall. Not the measured pace of the Navy Guards, the fast, synchronized stride of a tactical team. "Sergeant Vance," a voice boomed, Thorne's voice, but it was different now. It was the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose, a man who had decided to burn the hospital down rather than be caught in the surgery. "The transfer orders have been moved up. You're coming with us. Now." Silas stood up, his body trembling but his stance firm. He stepped between Alina and the door. "She's not going anywhere, Major. She's in the custody of the JAG Corps." Thorne appeared in the doorway, his face pale and sweating, his tie loosened, his eyes wild. He wasn't alone. 2 men in civilian tactical gear stood behind him, Vanguard operators, their faces hidden behind black balaclavas. "The JAG doesn't have jurisdiction here," Thorne said, his hand hovering over his sidearm. "This is a matter of national security. The sergeant is being transferred to a secure facility for further questioning. Out of the way, specialist." The air in the small cell turned electric, the tension of physical cords stretched to the breaking point. Alina watched from the bunk, her mind moving with a sudden, sharp clarity despite the fever. She saw the way Thorne's hand shook. She saw the way the Vanguard operators shifted their weight, their eyes darting to the security cameras in the hallway. They were desperate. The truth was out, the files were with the Senate, and the only thing left for them was to make the witness disappear. "Major," the JAG officer said, his voice calm and level, "if you take one more step into this cell, you are committing an act of treason. I have already notified the base commander. I have already notified the FBI. You are done." Thorne laughed, a high, jagged sound. "The FBI? By the time they get here, the sergeant will be over the Pacific. And you'll just be another casualty of a prisoner escape gone wrong." He drew his weapon. Alina didn't scream. She didn't pray. She reached into the sling of her left arm, her fingers finding the small, jagged piece of the LMTV mirror she had hidden there before the state trooper had found her. It was a 3-inch shard of American-made glass, sharp as a diamond and twice as cold. She wasn't a soldier anymore. She wasn't a prisoner. She was the surgeon, and she was about to make the final incision. The sound of the Blackhawk's rotors grew louder, a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the brig. The lights in the hallway flickered and died, plunged into the red glow of the emergency system. In the shadows, Alina Vance stood up. She felt the pain in her shoulder, she felt the fire in her lungs, she felt the weight of the 12 years she had given to a country that was currently trying to kill her. She felt it all, and then she let it go. "Major," she said, her voice a low, melodic anchor in the chaos. Thorne turned to look at her, the muzzle of his Beretta 92 FS tracking toward her chest. "The surgery is over," Alina said, And then the world went black. The silence that followed was not the silence of the woods. It was the silence of a room where everyone is holding their breath, waiting for the first sound of a heart beating again. It was the silence of the cost finally arriving in full. In the darkness of the cell in the heart of the storm, Alina Vance waited. She knew she had done what she had to do. She knew that whatever happened next, the truth was no longer a secret. It was a virus, and it was spreading through the halls of power, through the ranks of the army, through the conscience of a nation. She closed her eyes, the sound of the river still echoing in her ears. She thought about Miller. She thought about the boy in the trench. She thought about the woman she had been before she had found the manifests. "The weight is mine," she whispered. But as the first light of a new dawn began to filter through the cracks in the steel door, she knew she was wrong. The weight belonged to everyone now, and the reckoning had only just begun. The floor of the cell was cold, but for the first time in a week, Alina Vance felt like she could finally breathe. The air was thin, the room was small, and the future was a dark, uncertain road. But she was still standing. She was still the surgeon, and she was ready for the next patient. The door groaned as it was forced open from the outside, the light of a dozen tactical flashlights flooding the room. Alina didn't squint. She didn't look away. She watched as the men in the uniforms she used to wear rushed into the room, their voices a cacophony of orders and questions. She saw Thorne being slammed against the wall, the handcuffs clicking shut with a finality that felt like a prayer answered. She saw Silas being led away, his head held high. She saw the JAG officer picking up his briefcase, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. And then she saw the woman. Lieutenant Commander Jenkins pushed through the crowd, her medical bag in hand, her eyes fixed on Alina. She didn't say a word. She just knelt down, her fingers finding the pulse in Alina's neck, steady, slow, and defiant. "You're going to be okay, Sergeant," Jenkins said, her voice thick with emotion. Alina looked at her, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "I know," she said. The cost was undeniable. Her career was a scorched earth. Her body was a map of trauma. Her name would be a footnote in a scandal that would shake the Pentagon to its foundations. But as she was lifted onto the gurney, as she was carried out of the brig and into the cold, clean air of the morning, Alina Vance felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The infection had been excised. The truth had survived the night. And though the recovery would be long and painful, the surgeon had done her job. She looked up at the sky, the gray clouds breaking to reveal a single, sharp sliver of blue. The Pacific Northwest was a beautiful, brutal place, a land of deep forests and hidden secrets. But as the ambulance pulled away, the sirens wailing a song of rescue and reckoning, Alina knew that the secrets were gone. The world was watching. And for the first time in her life, Alina Vance was ready to be seen. The end of Part 4 found Alina in the back of a medevac bird, the same kind of bird she had spent 1,000 hours in, but this time, she was the one on the litter. She watched the green canopy of the Washington woods slide away beneath her, the Yakima Valley, a distant, dark memory. She was moving toward the final hearing, toward the final confrontation, toward the moment when she would have to face the men who had broken her and tell them why she was still whole. The weight was heavy. The cost was high. But as the bird banked toward the horizon, Alina Vance closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the rotors carry her home. The story wasn't over. The surgery wasn't finished. But the first incision had been made, and the truth was finally, irrevocably, out in the light. The ceiling of the intensive care unit at Madigan Army Medical Center was a grid of acoustic tiles, each one punctuated by thousands of tiny, uniform holes that seemed to vibrate whenever the heavy equipment in the hallway cycled on. Alina watched them through a haze of high-grade analgesics and the rhythmic, reassuring hiss of the ventilator that was doing 60% of the work for her left lung. The light in the room was a permanent, sterile twilight designed to keep the circadian rhythms of the dying from fraying entirely. She didn't know if it was Tuesday or Friday, but she knew the smell of the room. It was the scent of iodine, scorched dust from the heater, and the faint, sweet copper of her own blood. Every few hours, a nurse with a name tag that read *staff Sergeant Miller*, a different Miller, always a different Miller, would come in to check the chest tube that snaked out from between Alina's ribs. The nurse's hands were always cold, but the movements were practiced and efficient, the kind of professional touch that Alina herself had administered to 1,000 broken bodies in the Korangal and the Helmand. They didn't speak. In the hierarchy of the hospital, Alina was a Category 1 patient, a high-value asset under guard, but to the staff, she was a puzzle of trauma and recovery. They saw the jagged scar on her shoulder where the mirror shard had been removed. They saw the bruising on her neck where Thorne's fingers had left their mark. They did not see the sergeant who had dismantled a corporate conspiracy in a frozen trench. On what she estimated was the 4th day, the ventilator was wheeled out, and the silence of the room became a heavy, physical thing. Her throat felt as though it had been scrubbed with steel wool, but the air she drew into her lungs was hers. It tasted of nothing, which was the greatest luxury she had ever known. She sat up for the first time that afternoon, the movement a slow, agonizing negotiation with the stitched-together muscles of her core. The world tilted, a nauseating whirl of gray and white, and then settled. She wasn't alone. Special Agent Miller, the CID agent who had first interrogated her at JBLM, was sitting in a plastic chair in the corner of the room. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms covered in the faded, blue-ink tattoos of an infantryman. He was holding a cardboard cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, his eyes fixed on a small television mounted to the wall that was playing a muted news broadcast. "You're a hard woman to kill, Vance," Miller said without looking at her. His voice was sandpaper, tired and hollow. Alina tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. She reached for the plastic pitcher of water on the rolling tray. Miller stood, his joints popping, and poured her a cup. He held it for her while she drank, his hand steady as a rock. The water was the coldest thing she had ever felt, a sharp, crystalline shock to her system. "Thorne is in a black site in Virginia," Miller said, taking the cup back and setting it down. "The Vanguard Board of Directors is currently being liquidated by the SEC and the Department of Justice. The Senate Armed Services Committee got the drive. They didn't just get the telemetry, they got the emails. It turns out Thorne wasn't just testing the Block 4. He was a majority shareholder in the subsidiary that manufactured the guidance chips. He was trying to prove a success rate so he could trigger a $2 billion procurement contract before he retired." Alina leaned her head back against the thin hospital pillow. She watched a single bead of condensation crawl down the side of the water pitcher. "And the men," she rasped, "the ones in the trench, the Army is calling it a systemic equipment failure," Miller said, his jaw tightening. "They're giving the families the full benefit package. It's not the truth, but it's the money they need. The Army isn't ready to admit it was conducting live-fire tests on its own people. Not yet, maybe never." "The report," Alina said. "What does it say about me?" Miller finally looked at her. There was something in his gaze she hadn't seen before, a profound, weary respect that went beyond rank or protocol. "The official report says you were a victim of an unauthorized contractor assault, and that you acted within the scope of your duties as a medical officer to protect sensitive assets. It says you're a hero, Alina. But the unofficial report, the one that lives in the personnel files at the Pentagon, says you're a liability," Miller said softly. "It says you have a tendency to ignore the chain of command when your personal ethics are challenged. It says you're too smart for your own good and too capable to be controlled. They can't court-martial you because you're the only thing keeping the Senate from burning the whole building down. But they can't keep you either." Alina felt a strange, cold relief wash over her. It was the same feeling she had when she finally closed a wound, the knowledge that the damaged part had been removed and what was left could finally begin to scar over. "I'm being discharged." "Other than honorable" was on the table for about 6 hours, Miller said, a grim smile touching his lips. Then the JAG officer, your namesake, threatened to call a press conference on the steps of the Capitol. You're getting a medical retirement, full benefits, honorably discharged for injuries sustained in the line of duty. You'll be out of the system by the end of the month. Where is Silas? He's back at his unit. He's being reassigned to a motor pool in Fort Riley, Kansas, far away from the noise. He's safe, Alina. He got his pension. He got his life back. He asked me to tell you that he's sorry he wasn't stronger, but he's thankful you were. Alina looked at her hands. They were thin now, the skin translucent and pale, the calluses from a decade of field medicine beginning to soften. She thought about the weight of the rifle, the weight of the trauma kit, the weight of the men she had carried through the mud. She felt the absence of that weight like a phantom limb. It was a lightness that felt more like a burden than the heaviness ever had. I did what I was trained to do, she said. No, Miller replied, standing up to leave. You did what most people are afraid to do. You looked at the machine and you told it no. The machine doesn't forget that, Alina, but neither do the people it was trying to grind up. He walked to the door, then paused, his hand on the heavy steel handle. There's a car waiting for you when you're cleared. It'll take you wherever you want to go. Just stay off the radar for a while. The world is going to be very interested in you for a few weeks, and then it'll find something else to watch, be somewhere else when that happens. He left, the door clicking shut with a sound that echoed in the quiet room. Alina turned her head toward the window. The blinds were partially open, revealing a slice of the gray Washington sky. A light rain was beginning to fall, the kind of steady, soaking drizzle that turned the needles of the Douglas firs into silver lace. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she didn't think about the next mission. She didn't think about the next patient. She just listened to the rain. 10 days later, Alina stood at the main gate of Joint Base Lewis McChord. She was wearing a pair of civilian jeans that felt too loose and a navy blue windbreaker she had bought at the PX. She carried a single olive drab duffel bag, the canvas worn and stained from years of travel. Her left arm was still in a sling, a reminder of the cost, but her stride was steady. The guard at the gate, a young specialist with a fresh haircut and eyes that hadn't seen anything yet, took her ID card. He looked at it, then looked at her. He saw the retired status on the screen. He saw the way she held herself, the quiet, controlled gravity of a person who had walked through the fire and come out the other side. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," the boy said, handing back the card. He gave her a sharp, crisp salute. Alina looked at him for a long moment. She didn't salute back. She wasn't a sergeant anymore. She was just a woman standing on the side of a road in America, watching the traffic go by. "Good luck, specialist," she said, her voice still a bit rough. She walked past the gate, the sound of her boots on the asphalt the only rhythm she had left. She didn't look back at the base. She didn't look at the flags. She looked at the road ahead, Highway 5 stretching out toward the horizon, a gray ribbon winding through the green heart of the state. A black SUV was parked on the shoulder, 100 yards past the gate. As she approached, the driver's side door opened, and a woman stepped out. It was Sarah Miller. She looked different without the hospital gown and the pallor of shock. She was wearing a simple summer dress and a cardigan, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked like a woman who was reclaiming her life, one breath at a time. "I didn't think you'd come," Alina said, stopping a few feet away. "I owed you a ride," Sarah replied. She looked at Alina's sling, then at the duffel bag. "The JAG told me where you were being released. I thought, and maybe you didn't have anywhere to go." "I have a sister in Missouri," Alina said, "a farm near the Current River. I haven't seen her in 3 years. Missouri is a long way from here," Sarah said. "I've got nothing but time." They stood there for a moment, two women bound together by a dead man and a secret that would never be fully told. The air smelled of wet pavement and pine needles, the classic heavy scent of the Northwest. "I have something for you," Sarah said. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. "It's my husband's. He started it when he went to basic training. He wrote about the things he saw, the things he didn't understand. There's a section in the back, from the week before the Yakima exercise. He wrote about you, Alina." Alina took the journal, the leather cool and smooth against her palm. She didn't open it. She couldn't, not yet. He said you were the only one who looked at the men like they were people, not just numbers on a roster, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. He said if anything ever happened, he hoped you'd be the one to find him. He was right. I couldn't save him, Sarah, Alina said, the words heavy with the truth she had carried since the trench. No, Sarah replied, stepping forward and taking Alina's hand. But you saved the truth of him. You didn't let him become a lie. That's more than most of us ever get. They got into the car, and the engine hummed to life. As they pulled onto the highway, the base faded into the rearview mirror, a collection of gray buildings and chain-link fences that had defined Alina's existence for 12 years. She felt the journal in her lap, a physical weight that didn't hurt. The drive east was long and quiet. They crossed the Cascades as the sun began to set, the mountains turning into jagged purple silhouettes against a sky of bruised orange and gold. They stayed in cheap motels where the air smelled of stale cigarettes and lemon furniture polish. They ate in diners where the coffee was burnt and the waitresses called them honey. They spoke very little about the army. They spoke about the weather, about the price of gas, about the way the light changed as they crossed the plains of Idaho and the big sky of Montana. Alina found herself watching Sarah. She watched the way the woman looked at the landscape, the way she seemed to be breathing in the vastness of the country as if she were trying to fill a hole in her soul. Alina realized that she was doing the same thing. For a decade, her world had been measured in meters, in sectors of fire, in the distance between a casualty and a medevac LZ. Now the world was infinite. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. On the third day, somewhere in the middle of Wyoming, they stopped at a rest area overlooking a vast, rolling prairie. The wind was whipping through the sagebrush, a dry, hot breath that felt like it was stripping away the last of the gray silt from the Titan River. Alina sat on a concrete picnic table, her sling removed for the hour to let the blood flow. She opened the journal for the first time. The handwriting was cramped and messy, the script of a man who was more comfortable with a wrench than a pen. She flipped to the back, her fingers trembling slightly. Asterisk April 12th, asterisk the entry began. Asterisk SGT Vance joined the unit today. She's quiet. Doesn't join in the bullshit in the barracks, but I watched her during the trauma lanes. She's got hands like a clockmaker, precise, like she can see through the skin. The guys are intimidated by her, I think. They think she's cold. They're wrong. She just knows what we're heading into better than we do. I feel safer knowing she's there. Like if the world falls apart, she's the one who's going to keep the pieces together. Asterisk, Alina closed the book. She looked out over the prairie, the grass rippling like the surface of an inland sea. She thought about the hidden capability Thorne had tried to exploit, the skill she had spent her life honing. She had always thought of her competence as a tool, a weapon to be used against the encroaching dark. She had never considered that it was also a shield for the people who couldn't protect themselves. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, walking up to the table. She was holding 2 cans of soda, the metal sweating in the heat. "I don't know," Alina said. "My sister has a clinic in town. She's been asking me to come home and help her for years. I told her I couldn't. I told her the army needed me. And now I think I need to be somewhere where the patients don't have rank," Alina said. She looked at her hands again. They weren't shaking. "I think I'd like to be a doctor, a real one, the kind that stays until the end of the recovery, not just until the bleeding stops." Sarah smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached her eyes. "You'd be a good doctor, Alina. You already are one." They reached Missouri 4 days later. The air was different here, thick and humid, smelling of damp earth and blooming honeysuckle. The Ozarks rose up like old green giants, their valleys filled with mist and the sound of hidden springs. Alina's sister, Clara, lived in a white farmhouse at the end of a long gravel drive. When the SUV pulled up, Clara was on the porch, her hands on her hips, her face a mask of disbelief that quickly melted into tears. She didn't wait for Alina to get out of the car. She ran down the steps, her boots kicking up dust, and threw her arms around Alina's neck. Alina winced as her shoulder protested, but she didn't pull away. She held onto her sister, the familiar scent of lavender and flower acting as an anchor, pulling her back into the world she had left behind. "You're home," Clara sobbed into her neck. "Oh, God, Alina, you're finally home." "I'm home," Alina whispered. Sarah stayed for dinner, a noisy, chaotic affair filled with Clara's 3 children and a husband who looked at Alina with a mixture of awe and trepidation. They ate fried chicken and mashed potatoes, the table crowded with bowls of green beans and cornbread. It was the kind of meal Alina had dreamed of in the cold nights of the Korangal, a feast of normalcy that felt more surreal than any combat zone. As the sun went down, casting long, golden shadows across the fields, Sarah stood up to leave. She had a sister in Illinois she was going to visit, a life she was still figuring out. Alina walked her to the car. The crickets were starting their evening chorus, a rhythmic, pulsing sound that filled the heavy air. "Thank you, Sarah," Alina said. "For the ride, for the journal, for everything." Sarah looked at her, her hand on the car door. "We're even, Alina. You gave me back my husband's name. I just gave you a lift." She paused, her expression turning serious. "The JAG called me this morning. She said the Senate hearings are going to be public. They're going to want you to testify. They're going to offer you protection, a new identity if you want it." Alina shook her head. "I don't want a new identity. I just want my own back. They'll call you a hero, you know? The news, the politicians. They're going to try to turn you into a symbol." "Let them," Alina said, her voice quiet and firm. "Symbols don't have to live with the choices they make. I do, and I'm okay with that." Sarah nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. She got into the car and drove away, the taillights disappearing into the darkness of the trees. Alina stood in the driveway for a long time, watching the dust settle. She felt the weight of the journal in her pocket, the weight of her sisters, love in the house behind her, the weight of the future ahead of her. It was a lot to carry, but she was the surgeon. She knew how to manage the load. The next few months were a blur of recovery and transition. Alina's shoulder healed, the purple bruising fading into a silvery scar that would always be a part of her. Her lungs cleared, the last of the Titan River finally purged from her system. She spent her days at Clara's clinic, a small brick building in the center of a town that had one stoplight and a hardware store that still sold penny candy. She wasn't a doctor yet, but she was the best nurse the town had ever seen. She stitched up gashes from rusted barbed wire, she set broken bones from tractor accidents, she sat with the elderly as they faded away in the quiet of their bedrooms. The people in town didn't know about the manifests. They didn't know about Major Thorn or the Block 4 kinetic penetrators. They just knew that Clara's sister had hands that didn't shake and eyes that saw everything. The Senate hearings came and went. Alina testified via a secure video link from a federal building in St. Louis. She wore a simple white blouse and her hair was pulled back. She didn't look like a soldier. She looked like a witness. She told them the truth. She didn't embellish. She didn't moralize. She spoke about the lot numbers of the munitions. She spoke about the telemetry data. She spoke about the men in the trench. She watched the faces of the senators as they realized the depth of the betrayal, the systemic rot that had allowed a man like Thorne to treat American soldiers like lab rats. When it was over, the chairman of the committee, a white-haired man with a voice like rolling thunder, leaned into his microphone. "Sergeant Vance," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "On behalf of this committee and the United States of America, I want to apologize. We failed you. We failed those men, and we can never truly make it right." Alina looked into the camera. She saw her own reflection in the lens, a woman who had lost everything she thought she was and found something better in the wreckage. "Don't apologize to me, Senator," she said. "Just make sure the next sergeant doesn't have to choose between her country and her conscience, because that's a choice no one should ever have to make." She turned off the screen before he could respond. She walked out of the federal building and into the bright, hot sun of a Missouri afternoon. She bought a cherry Coke from a street vendor and sat on a park bench, watching the pigeons. She felt the sun on her face, the simple, uncomplicated heat of a world that didn't need saving today. The fallout from the hearings was massive. High-ranking generals were forced into early retirement. Vanguard Solutions filed for bankruptcy. The Army announced a complete overhaul of its experimental munitions protocols. For a week, Alina's face was on the cover of every newspaper in the country. They called her the medic of conscience. They called her the whistleblower who wouldn't blink. And then, just as Miller had predicted, the world moved on. A new scandal broke in Washington. A celebrity got married. A storm hit the coast. The spotlight shifted, leaving Alina in the quiet, green shadows of the Ozarks. She liked it that way. On a Tuesday in October, exactly 6 months after she had walked out of the woods in Yakima, Alina drove her old, beat-up pickup truck down to the banks of the Current River. The leaves were at their peak, a riot of crimson and gold that looked like the world was on fire. The air was crisp, the first hint of winter riding on the breeze. She walked down to the water's edge, the gravel crunching under her boots. The river was clear and fast, the water swirling around the limestone bluffs like liquid glass. It was a different river than the Titan. This water wasn't trying to drown her. It was just moving home. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her old dog tags. They were scratched and dull, the edges worn smooth from years of banging against her chest. She looked at the name engraved on the metal. Asterisk Vance, Alina M. Asterisk, she thought about the woman who had worn these tags into the Corangle. She thought about the woman who had trusted the system, who had believed that the hierarchy was a sacred thing, that the mission was always pure. That woman was gone. She had died in a trench in Washington, and she wasn't coming back. Alina felt a sharp, sudden pang of grief for that younger version of herself, for the innocence that had been stripped away. But she also felt a profound sense of pride. She had survived the loss of her illusions. She had found a truth that was deeper than a uniform, a loyalty that was bigger than a rank. She looked at the dog tags one last time, then she wound the chain around her fingers and threw them. They caught the light for a split second, a silver flash against the blue sky, and then they vanished into the heart of the river with a soft, clean splash. She stood there for a long time, watching the ripples disappear. She felt the weight of the air on her skin, the weight of the ground beneath her feet. She felt the quiet strength of her own body, the resilience of a machine that had been broken and rebuilt, stronger in the places where the fractures had been. She wasn't a sergeant anymore. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a victim. She was Alina, and that was enough. She turned and walked back toward her truck, her stride long and easy. She had a shift at the clinic at noon. There was a young mother with a sick baby who needed her help. There was an old man with a heart that was tired of beating who needed someone to listen to his stories. There was a world of small, quiet hurts that needed the surgeon's touch. As she climbed into the cab, she saw a small, white envelope sitting on the passenger seat. It had no return address, just her name written in a precise, military hand. She opened it. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph was of a small, nondescript house in a suburb of Kansas City. In the front yard, a man was pushing a toddler on a swing. The man was thin, his hair was short, and he was laughing. It was Sila's. He looked happy. He looked whole. The note was short, written on a piece of yellow legal pad. Asterisk, the garden is doing well this year. The boy is starting preschool in the fall. We named his little sister Alina. She's got her mother's eyes and a stubbornness that I think she got from someone else. Thank you for the life, Sergeant. I'll make sure it's a good one. Asterisk, Alina felt a lump form in her throat, a warm, aching pressure that she didn't try to suppress. She looked at the photo of the little girl she would likely never meet, the child who carried her name into a world that was a little bit safer because of what had happened in that frozen trench. She put the photo on the dashboard, wedging it against the glass so she could see it while she drove. She started the engine, the familiar rumble of the truck a comforting sound in the quiet of the woods. She backed out of the turnaround and headed back toward town. She drove past the old cedar mill, past the fields of dried corn stalks, past the small, white church where the bell was ringing for a Tuesday service. She felt the rhythm of the road, the steady, predictable pulse of a life that was finally her own. She thought about the cost. She thought about the things she had lost, the career, the certainty, the person she used to see in the mirror. She knew she would never get those things back. She knew the scars would always be there, a map of the war she had fought in the dark. But as she reached the edge of town, the stoplight turning green as she approached, Elena Vance felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt hope. It wasn't the big, cinematic hope of a movie ending. It was the small, quiet hope of a person who knows that the morning will come, that the wounds will heal, and that the work is never truly finished. It was the hope of a doctor who knows that even when you can't save everyone, the saving matters. She pulled into the gravel lot of the clinic and turned off the engine. She sat there for a moment, looking at the brick building, the light reflecting off the windows. She saw Clara standing in the doorway, waving at her, a chart in her hand and a smile on her face. Elena picked up her bag and stepped out into the humid Missouri afternoon. She felt the warmth of the sun on her neck, the smell of wood smoke and rain in the air. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the sweet, uncomplicated air of home. She walked toward the door, her steps light and sure. She had spent 12 years learning how to stop people from dying. Now, she was finally going to learn how to help them live. The weight was still there, but she didn't mind it. It was her weight, she had earned it, and she knew exactly how to carry it. She stepped into the clinic, the bell above the door chiming a welcome. The room was filled with the sounds of people, the murmur of voices, the rustle of paper, the distant, steady beat of a heart on a monitor. It was the sound of the world continuing. It was the sound of the surgery being a success. Elena Vance hung her windbreaker on the hook behind the desk and picked up a stethoscope. She looked at the first name on the list, a young boy with a fever and a mother who was worried. She walked into the exam room and smiled at the child. "Hi there," she said, her voice soft and steady. "I'm Elena. Let's see what we can do to make you feel better." Outside, the sun continued its slow descent toward the hills, casting long, peaceful shadows over the river and the town. The world was a complicated, broken place, a machine that was always in need of repair. But in that small, brick building in the heart of the Ozarks, the surgeon was at work. And for today, that was enough. The light faded into the soft, purple twilight of an American evening, the stars beginning to prick through the velvet sky. The river continued to flow, a constant, unchanging force in a world of shifts and shadows. And in the quiet of the night, a woman who had seen the worst of the world sat on a porch, watching the fireflies dance in the tall grass. She held a cup of tea in her hands, the steam rising in the cool air. She thought about the soldiers in the trench, the men she had saved and the ones she hadn't. She whispered their names into the dark, a silent roll call that she would never stop performing. She was the guardian of their truth. She was the witness to their sacrifice, and she would never let them be forgotten. She leaned back in her chair, the wood creaking softly. She closed her eyes and listened to the sound of the wind in the pines, a low, melodic sigh that sounded like a long-awaited rest. The war was over. The surgery was finished. The cost had been paid in full. And as the first frost of autumn began to settle on the fields, turning the world into a landscape of silver and glass, Elena Vance finally, quietly, let herself sleep. The air smelled like the coming winter, sharp and clean, and full of the promise of a long, white silence.